Bullies try to tear the teacher's blouse in class. She makes them pay. Chapter 1. The unassuming arrival. The early September morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn as Rowan Blackwell stood before the imposing red brick facade of Abraham Lincoln High School in Denver, Colorado. The building stretched across nearly 3 city blocks, its Gothic revival architecture dating back to 1923, when the neighborhood had been home to Denver's emerging middle class. Now, 97 years later, the area had transformed into a complex tapestry of working families, recent immigrants, and long-established residents whose children attended one of the district's most challenging schools. Rowan adjusted the collar of her simple navy blouse, a modest piece from Target that she had chosen specifically for its professional appearance and practical price point. At 26, she possessed the kind of unremarkable beauty that often went unnoticed in crowded rooms. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slender frame that seemed almost fragile, she had learned early in life that her appearance could be both an advantage and a liability. Her brown hair, the color of rich espresso, was pulled back into a practical ponytail that she secured each morning with the same elastic band, a small ritual that helped calm her pre-work anxiety. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, chosen more for their affordability than fashion, but they gave her an intellectual appearance that she hoped would command respect in the classroom. Behind those glasses, intelligent green eyes held depths that few people had ever bothered to explore. Rowan had always been the quiet one, in elementary school, high school, college, and even during her student teaching assignments. She was the person who listened more than she spoke, who observed everything and revealed little about herself. Her modest clothing reflected not just her limited budget as a first-year teacher, but also her natural inclination toward blending into the background rather than standing out. What none of her new colleagues at Lincoln High School knew, what none of her university professors or cooperating teachers had discovered during her education program, was that beneath Rowan's unassuming exterior lay 8 years of intensive mixed martial arts training that had transformed her from a nervous college freshman into a lethal weapon wrapped in academic tweed. The journey had begun during her sophomore year at Colorado State University, when a late-night encounter with an aggressive drunk outside the campus library had left her shaken and determined never to feel helpless again. That Monday morning, she had walked into Elevation Fight Academy in Fort Collins, a no-nonsense MMA gym that had produced 3 UFC fighters and countless regional champions. She had expected to take a basic self-defense class and move on with her life. Instead, she had discovered a passion that consumed her spare time and reshaped her entire understanding of strength, discipline, and personal power. Under the tutelage of Master Carlos Mendoza, a second-generation Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt whose grandfather had trained with the Gracie family in Rio de Janeiro, Rowan had spent 4 years earning her black belt through a grueling regimen that tested not just her physical capabilities, but her mental resilience and emotional control. The gentle art of BJJ, as it was known, had taught her that size and strength mattered far less than technique, leverage, and timing, but Carlos had insisted that a complete martial artist needed more than ground fighting skills. Under the watchful eye of Kru Somchai Watanabe, a former Lumpini Stadium champion who had immigrated to Colorado after retiring from professional Muay Thai fighting in Thailand, Rowan had developed devastating striking skills that could end confrontations in seconds. Her shin kicks could splinter wooden boards, her elbows could crack concrete blocks, and her knees could double over opponents twice her size. She had sparred with fighters of every size, skill level, and temperament. She had competed in regional tournaments, earning medals and trophies that gathered dust in her apartment closet. She had broken training partners' ribs, accidentally, been submitted by blue belts half her age, regularly, and learned to absorb punishment that would hospitalize untrained individuals constantly. Yet, as she stood before Lincoln High School, clutching her worn leather messenger bag that contained lesson plans she had labored over for weeks. None of that training seemed relevant to her chosen profession. Teaching literature was her true passion, the reason she had endured 4 years of education courses, student teaching assignments, and certification exams that had left her financially depleted but academically prepared. Rowan believed deeply in the transformative power of literature. She had seen how the right book at the right moment could change a student's entire perspective on life. She had witnessed shy teenagers find their voice through poetry, struggling readers discover confidence through young adult novels, and rebellious students develop empathy through classic literature that forced them to see the world through different eyes. She kept her two worlds, the violent grace of martial arts and the intellectual beauty of teaching, completely separate. Her fellow teachers would know her as Miss Blackwell, the quiet literature teacher who stayed late to help struggling students and spent her own money on classroom supplies. Her training partners at the gym knew her as Rowan, the unassuming woman who could submit heavyweight men and trade strikes with professional fighters without batting an eye. The dichotomy felt natural to her. In the dojo, she was a predator, calculating, efficient, and relentlessly focused on improvement. In the classroom, she planned to be a nurturer, patient, encouraging, and dedicated to helping young minds discover their potential. Lincoln High School's sprawling campus consisted of 4 interconnected buildings that housed 36 classrooms, 2 gymnasiums, a library that had once been the pride of the district but now struggled with outdated technology and insufficient funding, and a cafeteria that served 800 students daily. The main building, where Rowan's classroom was located, had been renovated in the 1990s with federal improvement grants, but budget constraints meant that updates had been cosmetic rather than structural. The hallways were clean but worn, the lockers functional but dented, and the windows provided natural light but also leaked heat during Colorado's harsh winters. Rowan's assigned classroom, 204B, sat at the end of the second-floor hallway in what veteran teachers privately called Siberia, the remote section where new faculty were traditionally placed until they proved themselves worthy of more desirable locations. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It meant less foot traffic and fewer interruptions during class, but it also meant that when problems arose, help was far away and unlikely to arrive quickly. The classroom itself was a standard rectangle, 24 feet by 32 feet, with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly greenish hue. 30 desks arranged in 6 rows faced a whiteboard that had seen better days, its surface scarred by years of dry erase markers and the occasional frustrated erasure attempt. A teacher's desk dominated the front right corner, accompanied by a filing cabinet that would soon overflow with lesson plans, graded papers, and the administrative paperwork that consumed far more time than anyone outside education realized. Windows along the west wall provided a view of the school's courtyard, where students gathered during lunch and between classes. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose majestically against the Colorado sky, their snow-capped peaks a reminder of the natural beauty that surrounded the urban challenges of public education. Rowan had spent the previous week decorating her classroom with literary quotes, book covers, and inspirational posters purchased with her own limited funds. "The pen is mightier than the sword" was displayed prominently above the whiteboard, a motto she believed in deeply and one that would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Her bookshelf, assembled from IKEA furniture and filled with her personal collection of novels, poetry collections, and literary criticism, occupied the back corner near her desk. She had included popular young adult titles alongside classic literature, hoping to bridge the gap between what students wanted to read and what the curriculum required them to study. A small, succulent plant, her one concession to classroom decoration that served no educational purpose, sat on the windowsill, a gift from her mother, who had insisted that every teacher needed something alive to nurture during the difficult days that lay ahead. Chapter 2. The battlefield of room 204B. The second week of school began with the kind of cautious optimism that all new teachers experienced, a delicate balance between confidence in their preparation and anxiety about the realities they would soon face. Rowan had survived her first week at Lincoln High School without any major incidents, though she had already identified several students who would require extra attention and patience. Her schedule included 5 sections of American literature throughout the day, plus 1 study hall period that served as her planning time. Third period, which began at 10:47 a.m. and ended at 11:32 a.m., had quickly established itself as her most challenging class, a collection of 28 students whose academic abilities ranged from genuinely gifted to functionally illiterate, and whose attitudes toward education varied from enthusiastic to openly hostile. The morning sun slanted through the windows of room 204B as students shuffled in for third period American literature, their backpacks heavy with textbooks they rarely opened and smartphones they checked constantly despite the school's official technology policy. The air carried the familiar sense of teenage existence, too much body spray attempting to mask too little deodorant, the lingering aroma of cafeteria breakfast burritos, and the faint chemical smell of dry erase markers that seemed to permeate every classroom in America. "Good morning, everyone," Rowan said softly, her voice carrying the warmth she had practiced during her student teaching assignments. She stood behind her desk, lesson plan open to the carefully handwritten notes she had prepared the night before. "Please take out your copies of To Kill a Mockingbird. We'll be discussing Chapter 3 today, focusing on Scout's first day of school and what it reveals about social class in Maycomb." A sharp snicker erupted from the back corner of the classroom, where Braden Morrison had established his unofficial throne during the first week of classes. At 17, Braden commanded attention through sheer physical presence and the kind of arrogance that came from being the principal's nephew, a family connection that everyone in the school knew about, but few discussed openly. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing nearly 200 pounds, thanks to his position as starting linebacker on the varsity football team, Braden possessed the kind of athletic build that had been opening doors for him since middle school. His blonde hair was styled in the expensive fade cut that required weekly visits to the trendy barbershop downtown, and his clothes bore the logos of brands that cost more than most teachers earned in a week. Nike Air Jordans, Lululemon hoodies, and designer jeans set him apart from classmates who shopped at Target and Walmart. But it wasn't just his physical presence or expensive wardrobe that made Braden dangerous. It was his intelligence. He was smart enough to understand exactly how much he could get away with, manipulative enough to stay just within the boundaries of plausible deniability, and socially aware enough to know which teachers would fight back and which would crumble under pressure. Flanking him sat his 2 closest allies in what was becoming an increasingly obvious campaign of classroom terrorism. Colton Hayes, a junior who had been held back in 8th grade, possessed the wiry build of a varsity basketball player and the calculating eyes of someone who had learned early that followers could gain power by attaching themselves to stronger personalities. His father worked as a shift supervisor at the Coors Brewery, and Colton had inherited both his dad's work ethic and his resentment of authority figures who acted like they were better than blue-collar families. Jackson Turner completed the trio with the kind of quiet intensity that made teachers nervous. His father owned Turner Construction, the largest building company in Jefferson County, and Jackson had grown up understanding that money could solve most problems and intimidation could handle the rest. At 16, he was already taller than most adults, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands that came from summers spent working construction sites. Unlike Braden's flashy designer clothes, Jackson dressed in work boots, Carhartt jeans, and plain t-shirts that somehow seemed more threatening than his friends' expensive fashion statements. "Yo, Miss Blackwell," Braden called out, deliberately mispronouncing her name as Blackhole, while his friends snickered appreciatively. "Why we gotta read this old garbage? Nobody cares about some dead guy's book from like 100 years ago." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the challenge in his tone, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was happening. Those who had attended Lincoln High School long enough knew the pattern. New teachers arrived with enthusiasm and idealism, only to be systematically broken down by students who had perfected the art of psychological warfare. Rowan had faced similar challenges during her student teaching assignments at middle schools in Fort Collins and Greeley, but something about Braden's smirk suggested this was merely an opening salvo in what would become a prolonged campaign. His body language radiated the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, and his timing indicated that he had already identified her as a target worth pursuing. "Literature helps us understand different perspectives and time periods," she replied calmly, turning toward the whiteboard to write the day's learning objectives in her careful handwriting. Harper Lee's novel addresses themes of prejudice, social justice, and moral courage that remain relevant today. The book was published in 1960, not 100 years ago. She had learned during her education courses to address misconceptions directly but without embarrassing students, to redirect negative energy toward productive discussion, and to maintain classroom momentum despite interruptions. Her cooperating teachers had emphasized that consistency and patience were more effective than confrontation when dealing with disruptive behavior. "Yeah, right," Colton chimed in, his voice carrying the dismissive tone that teenagers had perfected for generations. "My dad says teachers just pick boring stuff to torture us. Says real education happens in the real world, not sitting around talking about made-up stories." His comment earned approving nods from several classmates who had heard similar sentiments at home. Many of Lincoln High School students came from families where higher education was viewed with suspicion, where academic achievement was seen as pretentious, and where teachers were regarded as overpaid babysitters who couldn't handle real jobs in the private sector. Rowan continued writing on the whiteboard, refusing to take the bait despite feeling her heart rate increase slightly. She had learned during her martial arts training that the first rule of conflict was to avoid it when possible. De-escalation and patience often proved more effective than immediate confrontation, whether dealing with aggressive opponents in the gym or hostile students in the classroom. Today, we're going to explore how Scout's perspective on social class changes throughout her first day of school, she said, turning back to face the class with the kind of determined cheerfulness that new teachers relied upon to mask their growing anxiety. "Can anyone tell me what Scout notices about the Cunningham family that surprises her?" A few hands went up, mostly from students sitting in the front 2 rows who had actually done the reading assignment. Alexis Chen, a brilliant junior whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 5 years old, raised her hand with the eager energy of someone who genuinely loved literature and learning. But before Rowan could call on Alexis, Braden's chair creaked loudly as he leaned back in an exaggerated display of boredom. "This is so stupid," he announced to no one in particular, his voice pitched just loud enough to be heard throughout the classroom, but not quite loud enough to justify immediate disciplinary action. "Who cares what some little kid thinks about poor people?" The comment was designed to accomplish multiple goals simultaneously. It disrupted the lesson, demonstrated his contempt for the material, and sent a clear message to other students that he was the alpha personality in the room. Several classmates glanced between Braden and Rowan, waiting to see how she would respond to the challenge. "Braden," Rowan said firmly but without anger, "please save your comments for our class discussion." "Alexis, you were about to share your thoughts." But the damage was done. Alexis lowered her hand slightly, suddenly aware that participating enthusiastically might mark her as a target for Braden's group. Other students who had been prepared to engage with the lesson now seemed to reconsider their willingness to risk drawing attention to themselves. The pattern continued throughout the 45-minute class period. Braden would interrupt with loud sighs, inappropriate comments, and theatrical displays of disinterest, while Colton and Jackson amplified every disruption with stage whispers, exaggerated reactions, and the kind of group dynamics that transformed individual misbehavior into collective rebellion. When Rowan asked students to read silently, Jackson would tap his pen against his desk in a rhythmic pattern that gradually increased in volume until it became impossible to ignore. When she called for volunteers to read aloud, Colton would yawn loudly enough to make other students giggle. When she attempted to facilitate group discussions, Braden would make off-topic comments that derailed the conversation and left her struggling to regain momentum. "Miss Blackwell," Jackson announced during a particularly focused moment when several students were actually engaging with the text, "I think there's something wrong with my desk." He began banging his textbook against the metal surface, creating a rhythmic percussion that made concentration impossible for anyone in the classroom. The noise was deliberate, calculated, and perfectly timed to maximize disruption while maintaining plausible deniability. If questioned, Jackson could claim that his desk was actually loose or that he was simply trying to get her attention about a legitimate problem. "Please stop," Rowan requested steadily, her voice maintaining the professional tone she had practiced during role-playing exercises in her education courses. "Others are trying to read and concentrate." "Oh, sorry, Teach," Jackson replied with mock sincerity, his eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Didn't realize you were so sensitive. Maybe you should get some earplugs or something." The suggestion brought snickers from around the room, and Rowan felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized that her authority was being systematically undermined in front of the entire class. Every teacher faced challenging students, but there was something particularly calculating about this group's approach that suggested they had experience breaking down adult authority figures. Other students watched these exchanges with the kind of morbid fascination that accompanies any public confrontation. Some looked genuinely sympathetic, particularly students like Alexis, who were serious about their education and recognized the unfairness of the situation. Others seemed amused by the entertainment value of watching their teacher struggle to maintain control. A few appeared uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, understanding instinctively that supporting an embattled teacher might make them targets for similar treatment. Chapter 3. The isolation deepens. The days blended together in a haze of small humiliations and growing anxiety as Braden's campaign against Rowan intensified with the methodical precision of a military operation. What had begun as sporadic disruptions during the second week of school evolved into daily, systematic attacks designed to erode her confidence, undermine her authority, and ultimately force her resignation from Lincoln High School. The tactics were sophisticated in their simplicity. Braden had clearly studied the boundaries of what administrators would consider actionable behavior, and he operated just within those limits with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of plausible deniability. He would arrive to third period exactly 2 minutes late every day, ensuring that he missed her opening remarks while forcing her to repeat instructions for his benefit. The timing was perfect, not late enough to justify sending him to the office, but disruptive enough to break her momentum and signal to other students that punctuality was optional. The door to room 204B was heavy and equipped with an automatic closing mechanism that had been installed during the 1990s renovation. When opened quickly and released, it would slam shut with a bang that could be heard throughout the second-floor hallway. Braden had mastered the technique of entering the classroom with just enough force to create maximum noise while maintaining the appearance of an accident. "Sorry, Miss Blackwell," he would say with theatrical concern, his hand pressed to his chest in mock dismay. I didn't mean to slam the door. These things are so heavy." His daily entrance became a performance that other students began anticipating with anticipatory smiles. They would turn in their seats to watch his grand arrival, and some began timing their own activities to coincide with the disruption he created. Once seated, Braden would spend the first 10 minutes of class conducting an elaborate ritual of unpacking his backpack with maximum noise and minimum efficiency. Every zipper had to be opened and closed multiple times. Every notebook had to be flipped through completely before being placed on his desk. Every pen had to be clicked repeatedly to ensure it was functioning properly. The cumulative effect was devastating to classroom momentum. By the time Braden was settled and ready to participate, Rowan had lost precious instructional time and the attention of students who were more interested in the drama unfolding in the back corner than the literary analysis she was attempting to facilitate. His interruptions during lessons became increasingly sophisticated. He would raise his hand with apparent earnestness and wait to be called upon before asking questions that were designed to derail the discussion rather than enhance it. "Miss Blackwell," he would say with the polite tone that teachers are trained to encourage, "I don't understand why we have to analyze what the author meant. Isn't it possible that the author didn't mean anything at all? Maybe they just wrote words down and we're making up all this symbolism stuff." The question was clever in its ability to undermine the entire premise of literary analysis while appearing to engage with the material. Answering it required significant class time and philosophical explanation that most 11th graders weren't prepared to follow. But ignoring it made Rowan appear dismissive of student questions. Colton and Jackson had developed their own complementary strategies. Colton specialized in stage whispers, comments made just loudly enough for nearby students to hear, but not quite loud enough to justify direct confrontation. "This is so stupid," he would mutter during discussions of symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird. "We're spending 45 minutes talking about a bird that doesn't even exist. I bet the author would think we're all crazy if he knew we were analyzing his book like this," Jackson would add, his voice carrying the kind of reasonable doubt that made other students question whether their time was being well spent. The comments were designed to create ambient negativity that slowly poisoned the classroom atmosphere. Students who might otherwise be willing to engage with the material found themselves questioning whether the exercise was worthwhile, whether their teacher knew what she was talking about, and whether their energy might be better spent on more practical pursuits. Jackson's specialty was the strategic deployment of electronic devices. Despite Lincoln High School's official policy prohibiting cell phone use during class, enforcement was inconsistent and largely dependent on individual teachers' willingness to engage in daily battles over technology. He would place his phone on his desk in a way that made it visible to students around him, but not immediately obvious to Rowan at the front of the classroom. Throughout the lesson, he would receive text messages, social media notifications, and other alerts that caused the device to buzz, chirp, and flash at irregular intervals. The sounds were subtle enough that Rowan couldn't always identify their source, but persistent enough to create a constant undercurrent of distraction. Students near Jackson would glance at his phone screen, often seeing messages that he had orchestrated with friends in other classes, specifically to disrupt the lesson. "Sorry, Miss Blackwell," he would say when directly confronted, holding up the phone with apparent confusion. "I thought I turned this off. Technology is so weird sometimes." The apology would be accompanied by an elaborate show of powering down the device, complete with multiple button presses and exaggerated concentration. But the phone would mysteriously reactivate itself within minutes, beginning the cycle anew. Perhaps most damaging was the trio's effect on classroom participation. Students like Alexis Chen, who genuinely enjoyed literature and academic discussion, found themselves reluctant to share their thoughts for fear of being mocked or targeted for additional harassment. During a lesson on the theme of prejudice in Harper Lee's novel, Alexis had raised her hand to share an insightful connection between Scout's initial prejudice against Boo Radley and the town's prejudice against Tom Robinson. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful analysis that teachers hope to inspire, and Rowan had been encouraging her to continue when Braden interrupted. "Oh, great," he said in a stage whisper that carried throughout the classroom. "Here comes another one of Alexis's book reports. Does she ever talk about anything except school?" The comment was cruel in its accuracy. Alexis was indeed passionate about academics and devastating in its timing. She stopped mid-sentence, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as snickers rippled through the room. When Rowan attempted to redirect attention back to her comment, Alexis shook her head and mumbled something about forgetting what she was going to say. The incident sent a clear message to other students. Participation in class discussion was a risk that could result in public humiliation. Over the following days, fewer hands went up when Rowan asked questions. The students who did respond gave increasingly brief, safe answers that demonstrated minimal engagement with the material. The psychological warfare extended beyond the classroom through social media platforms that Rowan wasn't even aware existed. Braden had created a group chat that included most of the students in third-period American literature, where he provided running commentary on her teaching performance, her clothing choices, and her apparent inability to maintain classroom control. "Black Hole is wearing the same blouse again," read one message that was screenshot and shared beyond the original group. "Does she only own like 3 shirts? She's so nervous when she talks," read another. "Her voice shakes when she tries to act tough. It's actually kind of sad." The messages were crafted to be cruel without being explicitly threatening, ensuring that if school administrators ever saw them, they would be difficult to classify as cyberbullying. But their effect on classroom dynamics was profound. Students would reference inside jokes from the group chat, share meaningful looks during lessons, and generally behave as if they were part of an ongoing private conversation that excluded their teacher. Rowan began to notice that conversations would stop when she approached groups of students in the hallway, that certain students would smirk when making eye contact with her, and that her classroom had developed an atmosphere of barely suppressed hostility that made teaching feel like an uphill battle against active resistance. Chapter 4. The wider context. Lincoln High School operated within the larger ecosystem of Jefferson County Public Schools, a district that served over 86,000 students across 155 schools, with an annual budget that never seemed adequate for the challenges it faced. The school itself enrolled approximately 1,200 students in grades 9 through 12, making it one of the larger high schools in the Denver metropolitan area. The building's red brick exterior and Gothic Revival architecture masked the complex social dynamics that played out within its walls every day. Students arrived from neighborhoods that ranged from million-dollar homes in the foothills to cramped apartment complexes near the interstate, creating a microcosm of economic inequality that teachers were expected to navigate while delivering consistent educational experiences to all. In this environment, family connections carried significant weight. Principal Robert Morrison had led Lincoln High School for 8 years, during which time he had developed a reputation for maintaining order through a combination of strict discipline and strategic compromise. His nephew Braden represented both his greatest success story, a student athlete who maintained passing grades and had never been suspended, and his greatest blind spot. The principal's relationship with his sister Sarah, Braden's mother, was complicated by years of family dynamics that predated his educational career. Sarah had struggled with addiction issues during Braden's elementary school years, and Robert had often served as a father figure during periods when his nephew's biological father was absent. The protective instincts that had developed during those difficult years now made it challenging for him to view Braden objectively in the school setting. Robert Morrison was not a bad administrator. He had successfully navigated budget cuts that had eliminated arts programs at other schools, had maintained graduation rates above district averages despite demographic challenges, and had built relationships with local businesses that provided internship opportunities for students who weren't college-bound. But like many principals in large public schools, he was stretched thin across dozens of competing priorities and relied heavily on department heads and veteran teachers to handle routine classroom management issues. Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson served as Lincoln High School's vice principal, a position that made her responsible for student discipline, attendance monitoring, and the kind of administrative tasks that kept the building functioning but rarely made headlines. At 53, she had spent her entire career in Jefferson County schools, working her way up from middle school teacher to assistant principal to her current role. Elizabeth Patterson had seen hundreds of new teachers come and go during her 2 decades in administration. She had learned to identify which ones would thrive in the challenging environment of public education and which ones would burn out before Christmas break. Her approach to supporting struggling teachers was pragmatic rather than idealistic. She provided resources and advice to those who seemed capable of adaptation, but she didn't invest significant energy in cases that appeared hopeless. When Rowan had attempted to discuss her classroom management challenges during the 3rd week of school, Mrs. Patterson's response had been shaped by years of experience with similar complaints. "Have you tried building rapport with these students?" she had asked, not looking up from the incident reports that covered her desk. "Sometimes when students act out, it's because they don't feel connected to the material or the teacher. Perhaps you could incorporate more contemporary examples that relate to their lives." The suggestion was well-intentioned, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening in room 204B. Mrs. Patterson was accustomed to dealing with students who disrupted classes because they were bored, confused, or seeking attention. She had less experience with the kind of systematic psychological warfare that Braden's group was conducting. "I've also found that involving parents can be very effective," she had continued, finally looking up from her paperwork with the kind of tired smile that administrators perfected after years of managing competing demands. "Sometimes students behave differently when they know their families are aware of classroom issues." Rowan had nodded politely and thanked Mrs. Patterson for her time, but the meeting had left her feeling more isolated than before. The administration's suggestion that she accommodate her tormentors rather than address their behavior sent a clear message about where institutional support would come from: nowhere. The suggestion to contact parents was particularly problematic, given the family connections involved. Calling Braden's mother would likely result in a conversation with the principal's sister, who had already demonstrated her willingness to defend her son's behavior regardless of evidence to the contrary. Colton's father had made his opinion of teachers clear during back-to-school night, when he had informed Rowan that real learning happens in the workplace, not sitting around discussing books that won't help my son get a job. Jackson's father was known throughout the district for his confrontational approach to any perceived criticism of his children, having forced 2 teachers at Jackson's previous school to transfer after filing formal complaints about their bias against students from business families. The isolation that Rowan felt was compounded by the physical layout of Lincoln High School itself. Room 204B's location at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway meant that her struggles were largely invisible to other faculty members who might have offered support or intervention. The veteran teachers who occupied the more desirable classrooms near the main office and faculty lounge were dealing with their own challenges and had little time or energy to mentor a new colleague whose problems seemed to indicate poor classroom management skills. During lunch periods, Rowan would sit alone in her classroom, using the time to grade papers and prepare lessons while other teachers gathered in the faculty lounge to share stories, trade resources, and provide each other with the emotional support that made difficult days bearable. She had attempted to join these informal gatherings during her first week, but the conversations often centered around students, families, and situations that she didn't yet understand, making her feel even more like an outsider. The few colleagues who had made efforts to welcome her were spread across different departments and grade levels, limiting their ability to provide specific advice about the challenges she was facing. Mr. Rodriguez, who taught Spanish in room 112, had been consistently friendly during brief hallway encounters, but his classes were filled with students who had chosen to study a foreign language, creating a very different dynamic from the required English courses that attracted reluctant participants. Ms. Walker, a veteran math teacher whose classroom was on the first floor, had offered encouraging words during a brief conversation in the copy room, but her experience was with students who either excelled at mathematical concepts or struggled with them. She had little insight into the kind of psychological manipulation that was becoming Rowan's daily reality. The guidance counselors, who might have been natural allies in addressing student behavior issues, were overwhelmed with college application deadlines, schedule changes, and crisis interventions that took precedence over what appeared to be routine classroom management problems. With caseloads of over 300 students each, they operated in a constant state of triage, addressing only the most urgent situations while hoping that other issues would resolve themselves. Chapter 5. A Glimmer of Light. In this environment of growing isolation and professional doubt, Rowan found an unexpected source of support in Mr. David Kim, the athletic director whose classroom was adjacent to hers in the remote section of the second floor. Their initial interactions had been limited to polite nods and brief greetings in the hallway, but proximity and shared exile from the building's social center had gradually fostered a genuine friendship. David Kim was 32 years old, Korean-American, and had been teaching at Lincoln High School for 6 years. He had started as a physical education teacher and wrestling coach before transitioning to his current role overseeing the school's athletic programs. His office, which occupied the classroom next to Rowan's, was filled with the organized chaos that characterized the workspace of someone juggling multiple sports seasons, equipment budgets, transportation schedules, and the complex personalities of high school athletes. Standing 6 feet tall, with the lean build of someone who had wrestled competitively through college, David possessed an easy confidence that came from years of managing teenage athletes who respected strength but responded to fairness. His black hair was always perfectly styled, and his clothes reflected the careful balance that male teachers navigated between professional appearance and practical durability. But it was his eyes that had first caught Rowan's attention, warm brown eyes that conveyed genuine kindness and the kind of intelligence that didn't need to announce itself. When he smiled, which was often, his entire face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed working with young people despite their challenges. Their first real conversation had occurred during the second week of school, when David had knocked on her classroom door during her planning period with a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. "Figured you might need this," he had said, offering her one of the cups with a smile that was both friendly and slightly conspiratorial. "The coffee in the faculty lounge is terrible, but there's a decent machine in the athletic department office." The gesture was simple but profound in its thoughtfulness. Rowan had been grading papers while fighting off the afternoon exhaustion that seemed to hit new teachers with particular intensity, and the caffeine was exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she had said, accepting the cup gratefully. "That's incredibly kind of you." "New teacher solidarity," David had replied, leaning against her doorframe with the casual comfort of someone who was genuinely at ease with himself. I remember what those first few months feel like. Everything seems overwhelming, and you start questioning whether you're cut out for this profession. His understanding had been a revelation. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln High School, Rowan was talking to someone who seemed to comprehend the unique challenges of public education without minimizing them or offering simplistic solutions. "Does it get easier?" she had asked, and the vulnerability in her voice had surprised her. "It gets different," David had said thoughtfully. "You've become a real leader in this building," Principal Morrison told her during her formal evaluation in March. "The way you handled that difficult situation has earned you respect throughout the district. I'd like you to consider presenting at the Spring Professional Development Conference about classroom management and conflict resolution." The invitation was both an honor and a recognition that her experience had value for other educators facing similar challenges. Rowan accepted the opportunity, understanding that sharing her story might help other teachers who were struggling with systematic harassment or feeling isolated in their professional struggles. Her presentation, titled "Strength Through Restraint: Integrating Personal Resources with Professional Responsibilities," drew one of the largest audiences at the conference. Teachers from across the district gathered to hear how she had navigated the complex intersection of personal safety, professional ethics, and educational effectiveness. "The key insight," she explained to the assembled educators, was learning that patience and strength aren't opposites. They're complementary qualities that become more powerful when used together. Being able to defend yourself doesn't mean you should, but knowing that you can provides the confidence needed to maintain professional standards without fear. Her perspective resonated with teachers who had felt powerless in the face of student aggression or administrative indifference. The questions and comments that followed her presentation revealed that many educators had experienced similar challenges, but lacked frameworks for addressing them effectively. "How do you maintain the balance between being approachable and being respected?" asked a middle school teacher who was clearly struggling with boundary issues in her own classroom. "By being consistent in your expectations and consequences while remaining fair and supportive," Rowan replied. "Students need to know that you care about their success, but they also need to understand that disrespect and disruption won't be tolerated. The key is having the confidence to enforce those boundaries when necessary." Her advice was practical and actionable, drawn from real experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and the feedback from conference participants was overwhelmingly positive. The success of her presentation led to additional speaking opportunities throughout the spring, including a workshop for new teachers and a panel discussion on classroom safety that was attended by district administrators and school board members. These professional development activities enhanced her reputation within the education community while providing her with a platform to advocate for better support systems for teachers facing difficult classroom situations. Meanwhile, her relationship with David Kim continued to deepen in ways that enhanced both their personal happiness and professional effectiveness. Their shared commitment to education, combined with their compatible personalities and mutual respect for each other's strengths, created a partnership that was both supportive and challenging. "I love watching you teach," David told her after observing one of her classes during a peer evaluation exercise. "You have this way of making literature come alive that gets students excited about reading and thinking." His admiration for her professional skills was matched by her appreciation for his administrative abilities and his talent for working with student athletes who often struggled in traditional academic settings. "You should see him with the wrestling team," she told her colleague Ms. Rodriguez during a conversation about effective teaching strategies. "He gets kids who hate school to work harder than they ever thought possible, and they respect him completely." Their relationship had become a source of strength for both of them, providing emotional support during challenging days and celebration during successful ones. They had begun making plans for the summer that included hiking expeditions in the Colorado mountains, visits to literary festivals in other states, and possibly moving in together when their leases expired in July. As the school year drew toward its conclusion, Rowan reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since that November afternoon when everything had changed. The shy, uncertain teacher who had arrived at Lincoln High School in August had evolved into a confident educator who commanded respect through competence, compassion, and the quiet strength that came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges might arise. Her students had changed as well, not just in their behavior, but in their understanding of respect, boundaries, and the importance of treating others with dignity. The lessons they had learned extended far beyond American literature to encompass life skills that would serve them well in college, careers, and personal relationships. Braden Morrison had become one of her most enthusiastic advocates, often staying after class to discuss books he was reading independently and seeking her advice about college applications and future career plans. "I'm thinking about studying education," he told her during one of their conversations in May. "I want to be the kind of teacher who helps kids learn about themselves while they're learning about subjects." His aspiration to become an educator was both touching and encouraging, representing a complete reversal from the student who had once seemed determined to make learning impossible for everyone around him. "What changed your mind about school?" Rowan asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on the transformation that had occurred. "You showed me that being strong doesn't mean hurting people," he replied with the kind of insight that suggested genuine maturity. "I always thought power was about making others feel weak, but you proved that real strength comes from helping people become better than they were before." His understanding of the difference between dominance and leadership was exactly the kind of learning that education at its best could achieve, and his decision to pursue teaching suggested that the positive impact would extend to future students he would eventually influence. Colton Hayes and Jackson Turner had also made significant academic and personal progress during the spring semester. While their transformations were less dramatic than Braden's, both had developed better study habits, improved their grades, and begun participating in extracurricular activities that channeled their energy in positive directions. Colton had joined the debate team, where his argumentative nature became an asset rather than a liability, and Jackson had started working with the theater department on set construction, applying his technical skills to creative projects that benefited the entire school community. Other students in the class had also flourished in the improved learning environment. Alexis Chen had been accepted to several prestigious universities with scholarship offers based partly on essays that analyzed literature with the kind of sophistication that Rowan's teaching had helped her develop. "I wrote about how literature teaches us to see the world through other people's eyes," Alexis explained when she stopped by to share her acceptance letters. "I used examples from all the books we studied this year to show how reading makes us more empathetic and understanding." Her academic success was gratifying, but even more meaningful was her growth as a person who was confident in expressing her ideas and passionate about learning for its own sake. The success of her students extended beyond test scores and college acceptances to encompass the kind of personal development that would influence their entire lives. They had learned about respect, consequences, and the importance of standing up for what was right. They had seen that strength and gentleness could coexist, that patience and firmness weren't contradictory, and that real authority came from competence and character rather than intimidation or fear. Chapter 13. Integration and Reflection. As the final week of school arrived, Rowan found herself preparing for summer break with a sense of accomplishment and anticipation that was markedly different from the anxiety and uncertainty that had characterized her early months at Lincoln High School. The torn blouse from that November afternoon still hung in her closet at home, carefully preserved as a reminder of the day when everything had changed. She had chosen not to repair it, preferring to keep it as a symbol of the transformation that had occurred, both in herself and in her understanding of what it meant to be both strong and gentle in a profession that required both qualities. "Are you going to frame that thing?" David teased when he noticed the blouse during one of his visits to her apartment. "It's like a battle flag or something." "Maybe I will," Rowan replied with a smile. "It represents one of the most important days of my life. The day I learned that I didn't have to choose between being a martial artist and being a teacher. I could be both." The integration of her two identities had been one of the most valuable outcomes of the entire experience. She no longer felt the need to hide her martial arts background or to compartmentalize different aspects of her personality. Her students knew about her training, respected her abilities, and understood that her strength enhanced rather than threatened her effectiveness as an educator. Her reputation within the martial arts community had also evolved in positive directions. Master Carlos Mendoza, her Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor, had expressed pride in how she had handled the confrontation when she shared the story during a training session in December. "You used exactly the right amount of force," he had said, after reviewing video footage of the incident that had been shared on social media. "Perfect technique, complete control, and excellent judgment. That's what 8 years of training should produce." His approval meant a great deal to her, confirming that her response had been consistent with the principles and philosophy that had guided her martial arts education from the beginning. Kru Sumchai, her Muay Thai instructor, had been equally supportive of her actions and had used her story as a teaching example for other students about the responsible application of martial arts skills. "Fighting is last resort," he had explained to a group of new students, "but when fighting becomes necessary, you must be decisive and controlled." Rowan showed perfect warrior spirit, strong when strength was needed, gentle when gentleness was appropriate. The endorsement from her instructors helped her process any lingering doubts about whether her response had been appropriate or excessive. Their professional judgment confirmed that she had navigated an extremely difficult situation with skill and wisdom. The summer break provided an opportunity for reflection and planning that helped Rowan prepare for her second year at Lincoln High School with confidence and enthusiasm. She spent part of June attending a literature workshop at the University of Colorado, where she developed new curriculum ideas and connected with other educators who shared her passion for teaching. July was devoted to outdoor adventures with David, including a backpacking trip through Rocky Mountain National Park that tested their relationship under challenging conditions and strengthened their bond through shared experiences and mutual support. "I love how you approach challenges," David told her as they sat beside an alpine lake after completing a particularly difficult day of hiking. "You assess the situation, make a plan, and then execute it with complete confidence. It's the same whether you're dealing with a difficult trail or a difficult student." His observation highlighted the connections between her martial arts training, her outdoor recreation skills, and her teaching abilities. All three required similar mental qualities: patience, persistence, strategic thinking, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. August brought preparation for the new school year, but this time Rowan approached it with the confidence of someone who had proven herself capable of handling whatever challenges might arise. Her classroom setup included small touches that reflected her integrated identity: a framed photo of her receiving her black belt, a quote from Bruce Lee about being like water, and a bookshelf that included texts on both literature and martial arts philosophy. "Are you nervous about starting your second year?" asked Ms. Rodriguez during the preschool faculty retreat. "Excited," Rowan replied without hesitation. "I know who I am now, and I know what I'm capable of. That makes everything else feel manageable. Her confidence was justified when the new school year began, with students who had heard stories about her from older siblings and friends. Rather than testing her boundaries, they seemed eager to experience the kind of engaging literature classes that had become her reputation throughout the district. Miss Blackwell asked a nervous freshman during the first week of classes, "Is it true that you know karate?" "I study several martial arts," Rowan replied with a smile, "but I'm here to teach you about literature. If you work hard and treat everyone with respect, you'll never need to worry about anything else." Her response set the tone for relationships that were built on mutual respect rather than fear, and her classes quickly developed the kind of positive dynamics that made teaching rewarding for everyone involved. The integration of her martial arts background into her teaching identity also opened up new opportunities for service within the school community. She began offering an after-school self-defense workshop for female students, teaching basic techniques that could help them feel more confident and secure. "The most important thing," she would tell her self-defense students, "is developing the mindset that you have the right to defend yourself and the confidence to do so if necessary. The physical techniques are just tools. The real strength comes from believing that you deserve to be safe and respected." Her workshops were popular and effective, providing students with practical skills while also building the kind of confidence that carried over into academic and social situations. She also collaborated with David on developing leadership programs for student athletes that emphasized the responsible use of strength and influence. Their combined expertise in education, athletics, and personal development created programming that addressed character development alongside physical and academic achievement. "True leadership," she would explain to groups of student athletes, "means using your strength to protect and empower others, not to intimidate or dominate them. The strongest people are often the gentlest, because they don't need to prove anything to anyone." These leadership programs became models for other schools in the district and were eventually adopted as part of the official curriculum for students in athletic programs. Chapter 14: Legacy and Future. As her second year at Lincoln High School progressed, Rowan began to see the long-term impact of the changes that had begun with that November confrontation. Students throughout the school demonstrated better behavior. Teachers reported feeling more supported and respected, and the overall climate had shifted in positive directions that benefited everyone in the community. Her own professional development continued through advanced training in both education and martial arts. She completed a graduate course in educational psychology that helped her better understand adolescent behavior and development, and she earned her first-degree black belt in Muay Thai after years of dedicated training under Kru Somchai's guidance. "You have become complete martial artist," he told her during the promotion ceremony. "Strong body, calm mind, wise heart. This is what we seek to develop in all students." The recognition was meaningful, not just for the physical skills it represented, but for the personal growth and integration it symbolized. She had learned to be fully herself in all contexts, bringing her complete identity to both her professional and personal relationships. Her relationship with David had also continued to evolve in positive directions. They had moved in together during the summer, creating a household that reflected their shared values and complementary strengths. Their home became a gathering place for colleagues who appreciated the combination of intellectual stimulation and physical activity that characterized their lifestyle. "You two are the perfect example of what a healthy relationship looks like," their friend Ms. Rodriguez observed during a dinner party they hosted for fellow teachers. "You support each other's growth while maintaining your individual identities." The observation was accurate. They had found ways to enhance each other's effectiveness while pursuing their own goals and interests. David's administrative skills had helped Rowan organize her professional development activities, while her insights into classroom dynamics had informed his approach to working with student athletes. During the spring of her second year, Rowan received an offer to transfer to one of the district's most prestigious schools, where she would work with academically gifted students and have access to resources that Lincoln High School couldn't provide. "It's a great opportunity," Principal Morrison told her when presenting the offer. "You've more than proven yourself here, and this would be a significant step forward in your career." But after careful consideration, Rowan declined the transfer. Her roots at Lincoln High School had grown deep, and she believed that her skills were most needed in an environment where students faced the kinds of challenges that privileged schools rarely encountered. "I appreciate the offer," she told Principal Morrison, "but I think I can make the biggest difference right here. These students need teachers who won't give up on them, who understand that strength and compassion aren't contradictory." Her decision to stay was welcomed by students, colleagues, and administrators who had come to rely on her leadership and expertise. It also reflected her understanding that true success in education wasn't measured by the prestige of the institution, but by the positive impact on students who needed dedicated teachers the most. By the end of her second year, Rowan had been promoted to department head for English and Language Arts, a position that allowed her to mentor new teachers and influence curriculum decisions across the entire school. Her experience with classroom management challenges made her particularly effective at supporting colleagues who were struggling with difficult students or feeling isolated in their professional challenges. "Remember that you have more resources than you realize," she would tell new teachers during orientation sessions. "Your education, your experience, and your personal strengths all contribute to your effectiveness. Don't be afraid to use everything you have to create the learning environment your students deserve." Her advice was practical and encouraging, helping new educators understand that they could be fully themselves in the classroom rather than trying to conform to narrow definitions of what teachers should be. Chapter 15. Full Circle. 3 years after the confrontation that had changed everything, Rowan stood before a new group of students beginning their study of American literature. The confidence she projected was natural and effortless, born from experience rather than pretense, and her reputation had preceded her in ways that created immediate respect without fear. "Good morning, everyone," she said to the class of mixed juniors and seniors who would be studying advanced placement literature with her for the year. "I'm Miss Blackwell, and I'm excited to spend this year exploring some of the most important and influential works in American literature." Among her students was Braden Morrison's younger sister, Sarah, a sophomore who had specifically requested placement in Rowan's class despite being academically qualified for several other options. "My brother says you're the best teacher in the school," Sarah told her after class on the first day. "He says you changed his life and taught him what real strength looks like." The comment was touching and encouraging, representing the kind of lasting impact that education could achieve when it addressed both academic and personal development. Braden had indeed gone on to study education at Colorado State University, where he was thriving academically while preparing for a career in teaching. "He writes to me sometimes," Rowan told Sarah. "He's doing very well in college and still talks about becoming the kind of teacher who helps students discover their potential." The conversation reminded her of how far everyone had traveled since that difficult first semester and how positive change could ripple outward in ways that affected entire families and communities. Her classroom had become a model for other educators throughout the district, and she regularly hosted visitors who wanted to observe her teaching methods and classroom management strategies. What they found was an environment characterized by mutual respect, intellectual engagement, and the kind of safety that allowed students to take risks with their thinking and learning. "The secret," she would explain to visiting teachers, is being absolutely clear about your expectations while remaining flexible about how students meet them. You have to believe in their potential while holding them accountable for their choices. Her philosophy had been refined through years of experience and reflection, but its core remained the same principles she had learned through martial arts training: discipline, respect, persistence, and the understanding that true strength came from lifting others up rather than putting them down. The self-defense workshops she offered had evolved into a comprehensive program that addressed both physical safety and emotional resilience. Female students from across the district participated in sessions that combined practical techniques with discussions about confidence, boundaries, and personal empowerment. The goal isn't to turn you into fighters, she would explain during these workshops. It's to help you develop the confidence that comes from knowing you can protect yourself if necessary. That confidence changes how you carry yourself and how others perceive you. The program had been so successful that other schools had requested training for their own staff to implement similar offerings, and Rowan had begun conducting weekend workshops for educators who wanted to integrate these concepts into their own professional practice. Her relationship with David had also continued to flourish, and they had become one of the most respected couples within the Lincoln High School community. Their engagement during the spring of her third year was celebrated by colleagues and students alike, who saw their partnership as an example of how personal and professional lives could enhance each other. "You two are going to have the most interesting wedding ever," joked Ms. Rodriguez when they announced their engagement. "Half the guests will be teachers and half will be martial artists." The observation was more accurate than she realized. Their wedding guest list included educators from across the district, alongside training partners from various martial arts gyms, creating a celebration that reflected the full spectrum of their integrated lives. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of her impact came during the graduation ceremony at the end of her third year, when Alexis Chen, now a sophomore at Harvard University, returned to serve as the student speaker. "Lincoln High School taught me many things," Alexis said during her address to the graduating class, "but the most important lesson came from a teacher who showed me that strength and gentleness aren't opposites, they're partners. Miss Blackwell taught me that standing up for yourself and others isn't about dominance, it's about creating space for everyone to grow and learn." The speech brought tears to Rowan's eyes, as she realized that the lessons she had learned through her own struggles had become wisdom that would influence another generation of students facing their own challenges and opportunities. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered to celebrate their graduates, Rowan reflected on the journey that had brought her from that nervous new teacher who had arrived 3 years earlier to the confident educator she had become. The torn blouse still hung in her closet at home, but it no longer represented trauma or conflict. Instead, it had become a symbol of transformation, integration, and the understanding that every challenge contained the potential for growth and positive change. "What are you thinking about?" David asked as they walked together across the parking lot after the graduation ceremony. "Just remembering how different everything was 3 years ago," she replied, slipping her hand into his. "I was so worried about keeping different parts of my life separate, about what people would think if they knew I could fight. And now? Now I understand that all the different parts of who we are work together to make us more effective and more complete. The martial arts training didn't make me a worse teacher, it made me a better one. The teaching experience didn't make me a worse martial artist, it made me a more thoughtful one." Her insight reflected the wisdom that had emerged from navigating challenges that had initially seemed overwhelming. She had learned that strength and gentleness, patience and firmness, confidence and humility were not contradictory qualities, but complementary aspects of a fully developed character. As they drove home together, Discussing plans for their summer wedding and the hiking trip they had planned for their honeymoon, Rowan felt a deep sense of satisfaction with the life she had built and the person she had become. She was no longer the uncertain new teacher who had hoped to hide important aspects of her identity. Nor was she the defensive martial artist who had believed that strength required isolation from emotional vulnerability. Instead, she had become someone who could be fully present in all her relationships and roles, bringing her complete self to every situation while maintaining the wisdom to use her capabilities responsibly. The quiet strength that had been forged through years of training and tested through months of harassment had evolved into something deeper and more sustainable. A confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of contributing to the world. Most importantly, she had learned that true courage wasn't about never feeling afraid or uncertain. It was about acting with integrity and purpose even when fear was present, standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, and using whatever strengths you possessed to create positive change in the lives of others. As they pulled into the driveway of the home they shared, Rowan smiled at the thought of all the students she would teach in the years to come, all the lessons that would be learned and lives that would be changed through the simple but profound act of education. She had found her calling not in spite of the challenges she had faced, but because of them. The integration of strength and gentleness, of physical capability and intellectual passion, of personal resilience and professional dedication, had created something more powerful than any of those qualities could have achieved alone. And in the quiet moments before sleep that night, as she reflected on the transformation that had brought her to this point, Rowan understood that the most important lesson of all was one that would continue to unfold throughout her career and her life. That true strength was not about what you could do to others, but about what you could inspire them to become themselves. The story that had begun with a torn blouse and a moment of physical confrontation had evolved into something far more significant, a testament to the power of integration, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the understanding that our greatest challenges often become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions to the world. In room 204B, new students would learn about literature and life, about respect and consequences, about the difference between power and strength. They would see in their teacher an example of how apparent contradictions could be resolved into complementary strengths, how personal growth could enhance professional effectiveness, and how the courage to be fully yourself could inspire others to discover their own potential. And in the years to come, as those students faced their own challenges and opportunities, they would carry with them the lessons learned from a teacher who had shown them that true strength comes not from the ability to defeat others, but from the wisdom to help them rise. The end. Author's note: this expanded version of the teacher's quiet strength explores themes of personal integration, professional development, and the transformative power of education. At approximately 94,000 characters, it provides a comprehensive examination of how apparent contradictions, strength and gentleness, patience and firmness, martial arts and education can be resolved into complementary aspects of a fully developed character. The story demonstrates that our greatest challenges often become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions to others. Develop thicker skin, better instincts, and more effective strategies. But easy? Public education is never easy. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't been paying attention. Their coffee conversations became a regular occurrence, usually during planning periods or after school, when the building was quieter and they could talk without interruption. David proved to be an excellent listener who asked thoughtful questions without offering unsolicited advice, and his perspective on student behavior was shaped by years of working with athletes who channeled their energy into competitive sports rather than classroom disruption. The thing about teenagers he had explained during one of their conversations, is that they're always testing boundaries. It's developmental psychology. They need to figure out where the limits are and what happens when they push against them. The difference is whether they're testing those boundaries constructively or destructively. His insights into adolescent behavior were particularly valuable because they came from someone who had earned students' respect through athletic achievement and fair treatment rather than academic authority. The athletes he coached might challenge him during practice or question his decisions during games, but they respected his knowledge and trusted his judgment because he had proven himself in areas they valued. Have you noticed anything unusual about the students in your third period class? Rowan had asked during their fourth week of conversations, testing the waters to see if David had observed the patterns she was experiencing. You mean Braden Morrison and his crew? David had replied immediately, his expression becoming more serious. Yeah, I've noticed. They're smart enough to keep their behavior just within acceptable limits, but there's something calculated about how they operate. The confirmation that her perceptions were accurate had been both relieving and concerning. It meant she wasn't imagining the systematic nature of the harassment, but it also meant that the problem was visible to other faculty members who weren't intervening. Why don't other teachers do something about it, she had asked. David's answer had been uncomfortable in its honesty. Because Braden is the principal's nephew, because his friends come from influential families, and because addressing the problem would require administrators to acknowledge that it exists. It's easier to frame it as a new teacher who needs to develop better classroom management skills. The political realities he described were dispiriting, but they also helped Rowan understand why her attempts to seek support through official channels had been unsuccessful. The problem wasn't her teaching ability or classroom management skills. It was a systemic issue that the school was reluctant to address due to the complications it would create. Their relationship had evolved beyond collegial support to something approaching genuine friendship. They discovered shared interests in hiking, reading, and the kind of independent films that played at Denver's art house theaters. David's knowledge of Colorado's outdoor recreation opportunities was extensive, and he had begun suggesting trails and parks that might provide Rowan with the kind of stress relief that teaching often made necessary. There's this trail up in Golden that's perfect for afternoon hikes, he had mentioned during one of their conversations. Great views of the city, but not too challenging if you're going after a long day at school. The suggestion had led to their first meeting outside of Lincoln High School, a Saturday morning hike that had confirmed what Rowan had already suspected about David's character. He was thoughtful without being overbearing, funny without being inappropriate, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences without making her feel like a project he was trying to fix. Standing together on a rocky outcropping that provided panoramic views of the Denver metropolitan area spread out below them, Rowan had felt the first moments of genuine peace she had experienced since starting her teaching career. The autumn air was crisp and clean. The aspen trees were just beginning to turn golden, and for a few hours she was able to forget about lesson plans, student behavior, and the daily stress of classroom management. "This is exactly what I needed," she had said, breathing deeply and feeling tension leave her shoulders for the first time in weeks. "Teaching is one of those professions that can consume you if you let it," David had replied, his eyes focused on the distant mountains. "You have to find ways to remind yourself that there's a world outside of school, that your identity isn't just about what happens in your classroom." His perspective was shaped by years of observing teachers who had burned out from the emotional demands of public education, and his advice came from genuine concern for her well-being rather than professional obligation. As their friendship deepened, David became increasingly aware of the stress that Rowan was experiencing in her third period class. He had begun listening for unusual sounds from her classroom during his planning periods, and he had started timing his trips to the copy machine to coincide with her class changes so he could observe student behavior in the hallway. What he saw confirmed his growing concern. Braden, Colton, and Jackson would leave Rowan's classroom with the satisfied expressions of predators who had successfully completed a hunt. They would high-five each other, share private jokes, and generally behave like people who had just accomplished something they were proud of. Other students from the class would emerge looking uncomfortable, frustrated, or sympathetic, creating a clear division between those who were participating in the harassment and those who were witnessing it helplessly. David's athletic background had given him extensive experience with bullying behavior, both as someone who had witnessed it during his own high school career and as a coach who was trained to recognize and address it among team members. What he was observing had all the hallmarks of systematic psychological abuse designed to establish dominance and break down resistance. "How are things going with your third period class?" he had asked during one of their coffee conversations, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes reflecting genuine concern. "It's challenging," Rowan had replied, attempting to maintain the professional composure that teachers were expected to display when discussing difficult students. "But I'm learning a lot about classroom management." Her response was diplomatically worded, but didn't fool someone who had spent years reading between the lines of what students and colleagues were actually saying. David recognized the signs of someone who was struggling but wasn't ready to ask for help, either because she was too proud or because she had already learned that help wasn't available. He had begun developing his own strategy for providing support without overstepping boundaries or making Rowan feel like she was being rescued. As someone who understood the politics of Lincoln High School, he knew that direct intervention might create more problems than it solved, but he also recognized that the situation was escalating beyond normal teenage testing of boundaries. The friendship that was developing between them provided Rowan with something she hadn't realized she desperately needed: validation that she wasn't imagining the severity of what was happening in her classroom, and confirmation that the problem wasn't her inadequacy as a teacher, but rather a complex situation that would challenge even experienced educators. But it also complicated her emotional landscape in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. Her attraction to David was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and the kindness he showed her made her feel vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with her professional struggles and everything to do with her growing personal feelings for him. Chapter 6. The escalation begins. The third week of October brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Denver famous for its outdoor lifestyle, but inside room 204B, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly toxic as Braden's campaign against Rowan entered a new phase of sophisticated psychological warfare. What had begun as routine disruptions during the early weeks of school had evolved into something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated campaign designed not just to disrupt her lessons, but to systematically destroy her confidence, undermine her authority, and ultimately force her resignation from Lincoln High School. The escalation began with spatial manipulation. Braden had discovered that rearranging the desks in subtle ways could create chaos that appeared accidental while making it nearly impossible for Rowan to move freely around the classroom. He would arrive early, before she had time to prepare for the day, and shift desks just enough to create narrow passages and awkward angles that forced her to navigate a maze to reach the whiteboard, the bookshelf, or individual students who needed assistance. The changes were never dramatic enough to justify direct confrontation. A desk moved 6 inches to the left, another turned slightly toward the wall. A third shifted forward just enough to block the natural flow of foot traffic. Individually, each adjustment seemed insignificant. Collectively, they transformed the classroom into an obstacle course that made normal teaching movements difficult and potentially embarrassing. When Rowan attempted to walk from her desk to the whiteboard, she would find herself squeezing between desks, bumping into chairs, and generally appearing clumsy and unprepared. Students would snicker as she struggled to maneuver around the obstacles, and her face would flush with embarrassment as she realized that simple movements had become unnecessarily complicated. "Sorry, Miss Blackwell," Braden would say with mock concern when she bumped into a desk that hadn't been in that position the day before. "These desks are so heavy, sometimes they just shift around on their own." His innocent expression was perfectly calibrated to suggest that the rearrangement was accidental, while his eyes conveyed the message that it was entirely intentional. Other students would nod sympathetically, playing along with the fiction that furniture moved itself while enjoying the entertainment value of watching their teacher struggle with basic navigation. The second phase of escalation involved acoustic warfare designed to make concentrated thinking impossible for anyone in the classroom. Braden had mastered the art of creating rhythmic distractions that were just irregular enough to prevent students from adapting to them. He would click his pen in patterns that almost matched the rhythm of spoken language, causing listeners to unconsciously wait for the next click instead of focusing on the words being spoken. He would tap his foot against his desk leg in syncopated beats that created a constant background percussion. He would rustle papers, adjust his clothing, and shift in his seat at precisely the moments when Rowan was making important points or asking critical questions. The cumulative effect was devastating to classroom learning. Students would lose their train of thought mid-sentence when trying to answer questions. They would forget what they had just read when attempting to reference the text. They would become irritated and distracted without being able to identify exactly why their concentration was being compromised. Colton had developed a complementary strategy involving strategic coughing that was timed to interrupt key moments in lessons. He would clear his throat during pauses in discussion, cough loudly during quiet reading time, and make exaggerated sniffling sounds during film clips or audio recordings. "Sorry," he would whisper loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I think I'm getting sick. This weather makes my allergies crazy." The apologies were calculated to appear considerate while actually drawing more attention to the disruptions. Students would turn to look at him, teachers would pause to ask if he needed to see the nurse, and valuable instructional time would be lost to fake medical concerns that were perfectly timed to maximize their impact. Jackson's contribution to the acoustic assault was the strategic dropping of objects. He had perfected the timing required to accidentally knock textbooks off his desk during moments of silence, to drop pencils during important explanations, and to somehow allow his water bottle to roll off his desk and across the floor during particularly focused discussions. Each incident was followed by elaborate apologies and cleanup efforts that drew attention to the disruption while creating additional chaos. He would get up to retrieve the dropped item, accidentally bumping into other desks in the process, and generally creating a domino effect of distraction that could derail even the most carefully planned lesson. "I'm so clumsy today," he would announce to the classroom while crawling under desks to retrieve a pencil that had somehow rolled across the entire room. "Must not have had enough coffee this morning." The comments were designed to be relatable and harmless while ensuring that every disruption became a performance that other students felt compelled to watch rather than ignore. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging phase of the escalation was the introduction of personal humiliation tactics designed to make Rowan question her own competence and professional appearance. Braden had begun leaving crude drawings on the whiteboard that would be discovered when she arrived in the morning or returned from brief trips to the copy machine. The artwork was never explicitly obscene or threatening, maintaining his strategy of plausible deniability, but it was clearly intended to embarrass and intimidate. Stick figures labeled "teacher" would be depicted in various compromising or ridiculous situations. One drawing showed a stick figure with wild hair and crossed eyes standing in front of a classroom filled with sleeping students. Another portrayed a stick figure running away from larger figures labeled students, who were chasing her with what appeared to be textbooks. The drawings were always erased before administrators might see them, but they served their purpose of making Rowan feel watched, mocked, and unsafe in her own classroom. She began arriving earlier each morning to check for and remove any overnight vandalism, and she started feeling anxious about leaving her classroom unattended, even for brief periods. The psychological warfare extended to deliberate misinterpretation of her instructions and assignments. When she asked students to read pages 45-60 for homework, Braden would arrive the next day having read pages 54-69, claiming that he had misheard the assignment despite having written it down correctly in his notebook. "I could have sworn you said 54-69, he would insist with apparent sincerity, while other students looked confused about which assignment was correct. "Are you sure it wasn't 54-69? That would make more sense with where we stopped reading yesterday." The questioning was subtle but corrosive. It forced Rowan to spend class time clarifying instructions that had been clear, to repeat information that had been communicated effectively, and to doubt her own memory of what she had said. Other students would begin to question whether they had heard correctly, creating confusion that benefited no one except those who were deliberately creating chaos. Similar tactics were applied to test dates, essay requirements, and project deadlines. Information that had been written clearly on the board, included in printed handouts, and repeated multiple times would somehow be misunderstood by Braden's group, forcing Rowan to recommunicate basic details while appearing disorganized and unclear. The most insidious aspect of this strategy was that it was almost impossible to prove. When administrators or parents questioned discrepancies, Braden could produce notebooks with incorrect information written in his own handwriting, could cite conversations with classmates who confirmed his version of events, and could maintain the fiction that he was a conscientious student who was simply confused by unclear communication. The campaign began affecting Rowan's performance in other classes as well. The stress of anticipating daily harassment during third period made it difficult for her to maintain enthusiasm during first and second period, when she was already dreading what was to come. Similarly, the emotional exhaustion that followed third period made her less effective during fourth, fifth, and sixth periods, when she was still recovering from the morning's battles. Students in her other classes began noticing the change in her demeanor. She seemed more tired, less patient, and occasionally distracted by concerns that had nothing to do with the immediate lesson. While these students weren't participating in the harassment campaign, they were nonetheless affected by its consequences. Her lesson planning, which had once been meticulous and creative, became increasingly focused on survival rather than inspiration. She found herself choosing activities that would minimize opportunities for disruption rather than maximize learning potential. Group work was avoided because it gave troublemakers too many opportunities for chaos. Creative projects were abandoned in favor of individual assignments that could be completed silently. Class discussions were shortened to reduce the time available for hijacking by hostile students. The transformation was exactly what Braden's campaign was designed to achieve. An enthusiastic new teacher who had arrived with innovative ideas and genuine passion for literature was being systematically reduced to someone who was simply trying to make it through each day without complete humiliation. But what Braden and his allies didn't understand was that their target possessed resources they had never encountered in previous victims. 8 years of martial arts training had taught Rowan not just how to fight, but how to recognize escalating aggression, how to remain calm under pressure, and how to identify the precise moment when passive resistance was no longer an effective strategy. The signs of escalation were becoming impossible to ignore, and Rowan's instincts, honed by thousands of hours of sparring with opponents who were larger, stronger, and more experienced, were beginning to suggest that this situation was approaching a critical threshold where direct action might become necessary. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point approaches. November arrived with the first snow of the season, covering Lincoln High School's campus in a deceptively peaceful blanket of white that belied the growing tension within room 204B. The harassment campaign that had begun as teenage rebellion had evolved into something approaching systematic psychological torture, and even students who weren't directly involved were beginning to recognize that the situation had moved far beyond normal classroom disruption. Alexis Chen, whose genuine love of literature had made her one of Rowan's favorite students during the early weeks of school, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the toxic atmosphere that had developed in third-period American literature. As someone who valued education and respected teachers, she found herself caught between her desire to participate in class discussions and her growing fear of being targeted by Braden's group for appearing too engaged with the material. "It's not right what they're doing to her," she confided to her best friend Maria during lunch, her voice lowered despite the noise of the cafeteria. "Miss Blackwell is actually a really good teacher, but they're making it impossible for anyone to learn anything." Maria, who had Braden in her chemistry class, nodded with understanding. "He's like that in other classes too, but not as bad. I think he really has it out for her specifically." The conversation reflected a growing awareness among Lincoln High School students that something unusual was happening in room 204B. Teachers occasionally faced challenging students, but the systematic nature of what was occurring was unprecedented in most students' experience. Other faculty members were also beginning to notice changes in Rowan that extended beyond normal new teacher adjustment challenges. Her participation in faculty meetings had become minimal, her interactions with colleagues had grown more formal and distant, and her overall demeanor suggested someone who was operating under significant stress. Ms. Jennifer Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher whose classroom was on the first floor, had attempted to engage Rowan in conversation during a brief encounter in the copy room. "How are things going?" she had asked with genuine concern, noting the dark circles under Rowan's eyes and the tension in her shoulders. "Teaching your first year can be overwhelming." "Fine," Rowan had replied automatically, her response clearly rehearsed. "Just adjusting to everything. You know how it is." But Ms. Rodriguez did know how it was, having taught for 12 years, and what she was observing didn't match normal first-year challenges. The withdrawn, guarded person making copies was markedly different from the enthusiastic, idealistic teacher who had introduced herself during the August faculty retreat. David Kim had become increasingly concerned as his friendship with Rowan deepened, and he gained more insight into what she was experiencing during third period. Their coffee conversations had become less frequent as Rowan seemed to be withdrawing from social interactions, and when they did talk, she appeared distracted and defensive in ways that suggested the situation was taking a significant psychological toll. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" he had said during one of their after-school conversations, his tone carefully casual, but his eyes reflecting genuine worry. Sometimes it helps to have someone outside the situation to bounce ideas off of. Rowan had looked at him with an expression that seemed to combine gratitude with something approaching panic. "I appreciate that, David. I really do. But I need to figure out how to handle this myself. If I can't manage my own classroom, what kind of teacher does that make me?" Her response revealed the internal battle she was fighting between her professional pride and her growing recognition that the situation was beyond normal classroom management challenges. The isolation she felt was compounded by her belief that seeking help would be an admission of failure rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Meanwhile, the harassment campaign was entering its most dangerous phase as Braden began incorporating technology in ways that were far more invasive and personal than his previous tactics. He had somehow obtained Rowan's personal cell phone number, possibly through the school directory that was distributed to families, or through one of his connections to the athletic program, and had begun sending text messages during class that were designed to rattle her while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned. Her phone, which she kept on silent in her desk drawer during class, would buzz with messages that arrived at carefully timed intervals throughout the lesson. The frequency was irregular enough that she couldn't simply ignore the device, but consistent enough that it created a constant source of anxiety. "Your voice is putting me to sleep," read one message that arrived during a discussion of symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird. "When does this torture end?" read another that came during a writing workshop where students were supposed to be working silently on essay outlines. "Do you always talk this much?" appeared on her screen during a lesson on character development that required significant explanation of literary analysis techniques. The messages were never explicitly threatening or obscene, maintaining Braden's careful strategy of staying just within the boundaries of what could be dismissed as inappropriate but not dangerous. But their timing and content were clearly designed to disrupt her concentration and make her feel watched and judged throughout the class period. Each notification would cause her to glance involuntarily at her desk, creating brief moments of distraction that other students would notice. Braden and his allies would exchange knowing looks when they saw her react to the phone buzzes, enjoying the private knowledge that they were able to influence her behavior through invisible harassment. The psychological impact was amplified by Rowan's growing paranoia about how he had obtained her personal contact information and what other private details he might have access to. She began changing her daily routines, varying her arrival and departure times, and generally feeling like she was being stalked by someone who had more power and information than she was comfortable with. Colton had escalated his own contributions to the campaign by beginning to record brief video clips of classroom moments that could be taken out of context and shared on social media platforms. Using his phone's camera discreetly, he would capture footage of Rowan looking frustrated, stumbling over words, or appearing flustered by disruptions. The videos were edited to remove the context that would explain her reactions, creating clips that made her appear incompetent, unstable, or unprofessional. A moment of justified frustration with student behavior became a clip of an angry teacher losing control. A brief stumble over a word during a complex explanation became evidence of someone who didn't know her subject matter. These clips were shared on platforms that were invisible to school administrators but widely viewed by Lincoln High School students. Instagram stories, Snapchat posts, and TikTok videos began circulating with hashtags like Black Hole Teacher and Worst Class Ever, creating a narrative about Rowan that extended far beyond her actual classroom performance. The viral nature of social media meant that students who had never been in her classes were forming opinions about her teaching ability based on heavily edited clips that portrayed her in the worst possible light. She began noticing snickers and pointing when she walked through hallways, suggesting that her reputation was being systematically destroyed through digital manipulation. Jackson's contribution to this phase of the campaign was perhaps the most psychologically damaging because it targeted her sense of physical safety within the classroom. He had begun making subtle physical movements that suggested potential violence without crossing lines that would justify immediate intervention. When passing by her desk to sharpen a pencil or throw something away, he would veer closer than necessary, occasionally brushing against her chair or making her step aside to avoid contact. The movements were always brief and could be explained as accidents, but their frequency and timing suggested deliberate intimidation tactics. He would stand up suddenly during discussions, ostensibly to stretch or adjust his seating, but the movements would occur during moments when Rowan was speaking, creating a physical presence that was clearly intended to be disruptive and potentially threatening. Most disturbing was his habit of making prolonged eye contact that conveyed hostility without including words or gestures that could be reported to administrators. He would stare at her with an expression that seemed to promise future consequences for any attempts to discipline him or his friends. The combination of these tactics was creating a classroom environment that was becoming genuinely unsafe for learning. Students who wanted to participate in discussions were increasingly reluctant to draw attention to themselves. Those who had genuine questions about the material were afraid to ask for clarification. Even students who weren't directly involved in the harassment were being affected by the toxic atmosphere that made normal educational activities feel dangerous. Rowan found herself developing the hypervigilance that was characteristic of people living under constant threat. She would arrive at school each morning with her stomach in knots, dreading third period in ways that were affecting her sleep, her appetite, and her overall physical health. She was losing weight, developing headaches, and experiencing the kind of chronic stress that was unsustainable for anyone, much less someone trying to establish a career in education. Her lesson planning had become entirely focused on damage control rather than educational goals. She would choose activities based on their potential for minimizing disruption rather than maximizing learning. She would avoid calling on certain students not because they weren't prepared, but because she knew their responses would be used as opportunities for derailment. The transformation that was occurring was precisely what psychological harassment campaigns were designed to achieve. A confident, enthusiastic teacher was being systematically broken down into someone who was simply trying to survive each day without complete humiliation. But what Braden, Colton, and Jackson didn't understand was that their campaign was approaching a threshold that would trigger responses they had never encountered in previous victims. 8 years of martial arts training had taught Rowan to recognize escalating aggression patterns, and every instinct she had developed was beginning to suggest that the situation was moving toward a confrontation that would require physical intervention. The signs were unmistakable to someone trained to identify them. The increasing boldness of the harassment, the growing physical intimidation, the systematic isolation from potential support systems, and the escalating invasiveness of the attacks on her personal life and professional reputation. In the dojo, she had learned that some conflicts couldn't be resolved through de-escalation and patience. Some opponents only understood strength, and some situations required decisive action to prevent further escalation into genuinely dangerous territory. As November progressed toward its final week, Rowan began to sense that a critical moment was approaching, a point where the choice would be between continued submission to systematic abuse or a demonstration that she was not the helpless victim her tormentors assumed her to be. The quiet strength that had been forged through thousands of hours of training was beginning to stir, and the patience that had been tested daily for months was approaching its natural limits. Chapter 8. The Day. Everything changed. Friday, November 22nd, dawned grey and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that seemed to press down on Denver like a heavy blanket. Inside Lincoln High School, the atmosphere was charged with the restless energy that always preceded holiday breaks, as students and teachers alike counted down the hours until Thanksgiving vacation would provide temporary relief from the daily grind of public education. For Rowan Blackwell, the day began like so many others during the past 2 months, with a knot of anxiety in her stomach and the familiar dread that accompanied the approach of third-period American literature. She had awakened at 5:30 a.m. after another night of interrupted sleep, her mind cycling through potential scenarios for classroom management and her body responding to chronic stress with headaches that had become her constant companion. Her morning routine had become a ritual of preparation for battle rather than education. She dressed in her navy blouse, the same one that had been her favorite during the early weeks of school, but had now become almost like armor, chosen for its professional appearance and the confidence it had once given her. The fabric was thin and delicate, more suitable for office work than the psychological warfare that her classroom had become, but it represented her determination to maintain dignity despite the daily assaults on her authority and self-respect. As she drove through the empty streets toward Lincoln High School, Rowan found herself thinking about the conversation she had planned to have with David Kim after school. Their friendship had become increasingly important to her, providing a refuge from the isolation and stress that had consumed her professional life. She had been debating whether to confide in him about the full extent of what she was experiencing, knowing that his support would be valuable, but also recognizing that involving him might create complications she wasn't prepared to handle. The school parking lot was already half full when she arrived at 7:15 a.m., 45 minutes before first period would begin. She had started arriving early, partly to avoid encounters with students in the hallways, but mainly to have time to check her classroom for any overnight vandalism and to mentally prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Room 204B showed no signs of disturbance from the previous evening, but Rowan had learned not to trust the apparent calm. She spent several minutes rearranging desks that had somehow shifted during the night, checking her computer and projector to ensure they hadn't been tampered with, and reviewing her lesson plans one final time to make sure she was as prepared as possible for whatever disruptions might arise. The first 2 periods of the day passed without major incident. Her first period students were generally cooperative and engaged, providing a brief reminder of why she had chosen teaching as her profession. Second period included several challenging personalities, but nothing approaching the systematic hostility that had made third period such a trial. As 10:47 a.m. approached, Rowan felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded the daily ordeal. She positioned herself near the door to greet students as they entered, a strategy she had adopted to establish immediate eye contact and set a positive tone before disruptions could begin. The first students to arrive were the ones who genuinely cared about their education: Alexis Chen, Marcus Johnson, and several others who had consistently demonstrated respect for both the subject matter and their teacher, despite the toxic atmosphere that had developed around them. They took their seats quietly and began unpacking their materials with the efficiency of students who understood that preparation was essential for learning. Braden Morrison arrived at exactly 10:49 a.m., 2 minutes after the bell, maintaining his pattern of deliberate tardiness that maximized disruption while staying just within the boundaries of what administrators would consider actionable. His entrance was accompanied by the now familiar slam of the heavy door and the theatrical announcement of his presence to the entire classroom. "Sorry I'm late, Miss Blackwell," he said, with the mock sincerity that had become his trademark. "Got held up talking to my uncle, Principal Morrison, about some important school business." The reference to his family connection was deliberate, designed to remind everyone in the classroom that he operated under different rules and enjoyed protections that other students couldn't rely upon. It was also a subtle threat, suggesting that complaints about his behavior would be filtered through family loyalty rather than professional objectivity. Colton Hayes and Jackson Turner followed within the next minute, completing the trinity that had made third period such a nightmare. They took their seats in the back corner with the satisfied expressions of predators arriving at a familiar hunting ground, already exchanging meaningful glances and preparing for whatever entertainment they had planned for the day. "Good morning, everyone," Rowan said, her voice carrying the professional warmth she had maintained throughout the ordeal, despite the stress it had cost her. Please take out your copies of To Kill a Mockingbird. We'll be discussing Chapter 12 today, focusing on the theme of moral courage and how it applies to contemporary situations. The irony of discussing moral courage while experiencing systematic harassment was not lost on her, but she had learned to compartmentalize her personal struggles in order to continue providing educational value to the students who were genuinely interested in learning. Before we begin, she continued, I want to remind everyone that we'll be having our unit test next Tuesday, covering chapters 1 through 15. If you haven't been keeping up with the reading, this weekend would be an excellent time to catch up. Braden's hand shot up immediately, and Rowan recognized the calculated timing that had become characteristic of his disruptions. She knew that calling on him would likely derail the lesson, but ignoring raised hands went against every teaching instinct she had developed. Yes, Braden, she said, attempting to maintain the tone of respectful engagement that effective teachers used with all students, regardless of their behavior patterns. I was just wondering, he said with exaggerated thoughtfulness, if moral courage includes having the courage to tell someone when they're doing a terrible job at something. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and the classroom fell silent as 28 students recognized that they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal academic discussion. Even students who had grown accustomed to Braden's disruptions sensed that this moment was different, more personal, and potentially more dangerous than his usual tactics. That's an interesting question, Rowan replied carefully, her teacher training kicking in to help her navigate the obvious trap. Moral courage typically refers to the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. Can you think of an example from the novel that illustrates this concept? But Braden wasn't interested in literary analysis or educational dialogue. His question had been an opening move in what he had clearly planned as a culminating performance, and he wasn't going to be redirected toward legitimate academic discussion. No, hear me out, he continued, standing up with theatrical flair that immediately commanded the attention of every person in the room. Like, it takes real guts to tell someone they're boring, right? Especially when that someone is supposed to be teaching you something important. He began walking toward the front of the classroom, and Rowan instinctively stepped backward. The movement was subtle, but noticed by every student in the room, and the recognition that their teacher was retreating sent a ripple of excitement through the class as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. For example, Braden continued, now positioned halfway between his desk and hers, someone might have the courage to say that this class is a complete waste of time and that you're probably the worst teacher in the entire school. Colton and Jackson were on their feet now, moving to flank their leader in a formation that was clearly designed to intimidate through physical positioning. Other students remained seated, but had pulled out their phones, instinctively recognizing that they were about to witness something that would be worth recording and sharing. Please return to your seats, Rowan said, and for the first time in months, her voice showed the strain she had been working so hard to conceal. We need to focus on our lesson. Or someone might have the courage, Braden said, stepping closer, to point out that your outfit looks like it came from a thrift store clearance rack and that maybe teaching isn't really the right profession for someone who can't even handle a room full of teenagers. His friends laughed harshly, and Rowan felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized that the humiliation she had been dreading for weeks was finally arriving. The thought that David Kim might hear the commotion from his adjacent classroom made the situation even more unbearable, as she imagined him witnessing her complete professional collapse. That's enough, she said more firmly, but her voice cracked slightly on the words, revealing the emotional strain that months of harassment had created. Is it though? Braden asked, his tone becoming openly aggressive for the first time since the campaign had begun. because I think someone with real courage might even test just how much a person can take before they break completely." The words were a clear declaration of intent, and every student in the classroom understood that they were no longer witnessing typical teenage rebellion, but rather something approaching genuine assault. The phones that had been recording for entertainment purposes now captured footage that would document whatever was about to occur. Before Rowan could react, Braden's hand shot out and grabbed the collar of her navy blouse. The thin fabric that she had chosen for its professional appearance was never designed to withstand physical assault, and the sudden motion caused her to stumble backward against the whiteboard with a sharp impact that could be heard throughout the room. "Let me go," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was now coursing through her veins in response to the transition from psychological harassment to physical assault. "What if I don't want to?" Braden replied, his grip tightening on her collar as he pressed his advantage. "What if I think it might be interesting to see what happens when someone finally pushes back against all this academic bullshit?" His fingers began pulling at the delicate material, and Rowan could hear the slight tearing sound as seams strained under pressure that the fabric was never meant to handle. In her peripheral vision, she saw students holding up phones, documenting what they assumed would be her complete humiliation and the final destruction of her authority as an educator. But something fundamental had changed in Rowan's demeanor during the few seconds since physical contact had been initiated. Her breathing had shifted from the shallow panic of someone being victimized to the deep, controlled rhythm she had practiced thousands of times in Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes. Her stance, which had been defensive and retreating moments earlier, became balanced and centered as 8 years of martial arts training overrode months of patient endurance. Her weight settled into the balls of her feet, her shoulders relaxed despite the grip on her clothing, and her eyes focused with the kind of calm clarity that came from years of sparring with opponents who were larger, stronger, and more experienced than the teenager who had just made the mistake of initiating physical contact. "I said, let me go," she repeated, and this time her voice carried an edge that made several students look up from their phones with sudden attention. The tone was quiet, but contained something that students had never heard before. Not anger, not fear, but the kind of controlled intensity that suggested the person speaking was completely prepared for whatever might happen next. Braden either didn't notice the change in her demeanor or chose to ignore it, too committed to his public demonstration of dominance to recognize that he had just crossed a threshold that would trigger responses he had never encountered in previous victims. "Make me," he said with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, giving her blouse another sharp tug that tore the fabric at the shoulder seam with an audible rip. The sound of tearing cloth was the final trigger that released 8 years of disciplined training and months of accumulated frustration. Rowan's left hand moved with lightning speed, grasping Braden's wrist in a grip that immediately cut off circulation to his fingers, using a technique called kotegaishi that she had practiced thousands of times in Aikido classes. Simultaneously, her right hand struck his elbow at precisely the angle needed to hyperextend the joint and break his grip on her clothing, while her body pivoted to use his own momentum against him in a movement that was as graceful as it was devastating. The technique was called an inside wrist throw in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and Rowan executed it with the kind of textbook precision that would have earned approval from Master Carlos Mendoza. Braden's eyes widened in shock as his hand went numb and his arm was twisted behind his back in one fluid motion that demonstrated complete control over his larger, stronger body. Before he could react or resist, she had stepped to his side and used his own forward momentum to guide him face first against the whiteboard, where she controlled him with a combination of joint manipulation and strategic pressure points that rendered him completely helpless despite his size advantage. "What the hell?" Colton shouted, starting forward to help his friend, but stopping abruptly when Rowan's head turned toward him with a look that conveyed more threat than any words could have managed. There was no anger in her expression, only a calm calculation that suggested she was several steps ahead of any move he might make and completely prepared to handle multiple opponents if necessary. Her eyes held the kind of focused intensity that experienced fighters recognized as belonging to someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. "I wouldn't," she said simply, and something in her tone, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of, convinced him to freeze in place rather than escalate a situation that had already moved far beyond his understanding. Braden struggled against the hold that pinned him to the whiteboard, but every movement only tightened Rowan's control as she adjusted pressure and leverage, with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of practice. She had positioned his arm at the perfect angle to cause maximum discomfort without actual injury, a technique designed to subdue opponents without permanently harming them. "This is how this works," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the suddenly silent classroom. "You're going to apologize for grabbing me and tearing my shirt, or I can demonstrate some other techniques I learned during my 8 years of mixed martial arts training." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Students who had been recording what they expected to be a helpless teacher's humiliation suddenly found themselves witnessing something entirely different. A trained fighter exercising remarkable restraint while demonstrating capabilities that none of them had imagined possible. The phones continued recording, but the narrative had completely shifted from victim shaming to something approaching awe as students realized they were documenting not a teacher's breakdown, but rather a martial artist's measured response to physical assault. "You're crazy," Braden gasped, his face pressed against the board and his voice strained by the position his arm was being held in. "No," Rowan replied calmly. "I'm someone who chose to become a teacher because I believe in education and respect, but I'm also someone who won't be physically assaulted in her own classroom by students who have confused patience with weakness." Jackson, who had been circling to approach her from behind while she dealt with Braden, made the mistake of assuming that her focus on one opponent made her vulnerable to attack from another direction. It was exactly the kind of tactical error that revealed his complete lack of understanding about what he was dealing with. Rowan's peripheral vision, honed by years of sparring against multiple opponents in training scenarios designed to simulate real-world confrontations, caught his movement immediately. Without releasing her hold on Braden, she pivoted and delivered a precise back kick that caught Jackson in the solar plexus, doubling him over and sending him stumbling backward into a row of desks. The technique was called Ushiro Geri in karate, and Rowan had practiced it thousands of times against heavy bags, focus mitts, and live opponents who were trying to counterattack. She had pulled the kick significantly, using just enough force to wind him and demonstrate her capabilities without causing lasting damage or injury that would require medical attention. "Anyone else?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room with the calm confidence of someone who was completely in control of the situation and prepared to handle whatever additional challenges might arise. The classroom had descended into absolute silence, broken only by Jackson's labored breathing as he struggled to recover from the precisely delivered kick. Students who had been laughing and recording moments earlier now stared in wide-eyed amazement at their transformed teacher, suddenly understanding that they had been witnessing not weakness, but rather extraordinary self-control. Phones continued recording, but the footage they captured would tell a very different story than anyone had anticipated. Instead of a bullied teacher being humiliated, they documented a professional educator defending herself with skill, restraint, and complete control over a situation that her attackers had created. "Here's what's going to happen," Rowan announced, still maintaining her hold on Braden while keeping visual contact with the rest of the class. "You're going to apologize for touching me without permission and for destroying my property. Then you're going to sit down and participate in this class like the intelligent young man I know you can be." Her voice carried no vindictiveness or cruelty, only the kind of firm authority that came from someone who had proven her capability to handle whatever challenges might arise. "This is assault," Braden wheezed, though his protest lacked conviction and sounded more like a desperate attempt to regain some dignity than a genuine accusation. "No," Rowan corrected, with the patience of someone explaining a simple concept to a confused student. "Assault is what you did when you grabbed my clothing against my will and attempted to tear it off my body. This is self-defense, and I have 30 witnesses who can testify that I used the minimum force necessary to protect myself from your attack." She was absolutely right, and everyone in the room knew it. The phone recordings would show clearly that she had only acted after being physically grabbed, that her response had been precisely calibrated to stop the threat without causing unnecessary harm, and that she had maintained complete control throughout an incident that her attackers had initiated and escalated. The legal and ethical framework was crystal clear, and Rowan's explanation demonstrated not only her physical capabilities, but also her intellectual understanding of the situation she was managing. "I'm going to release you now," she continued, "and you're going to return to your seat. If you choose to escalate this situation further, I'll be happy to demonstrate some of the submission techniques I learned in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Some of them are quite unpleasant." The threat was delivered with the same calm professionalism she might use to explain homework requirements, but its implications were unmistakable. She was offering him an opportunity to end the confrontation with dignity, while making it clear that continued aggression would result in consequences he was not prepared to handle. Slowly, she released the pressure on his arm and stepped back, giving him space to move while remaining in a balanced stance that would allow her to react immediately if he chose to continue the confrontation. Her positioning demonstrated both confidence and tactical awareness, maintaining distance that would prevent surprise attacks while staying close enough to respond if necessary. Braden straightened up slowly, rubbing his wrist and staring at her with a mixture of shock, pain, and something that might have been respect. The arrogant teenager who had initiated the assault was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that he had seriously misjudged his target. The door burst open as David Kim rushed in. Having heard the commotion from his adjacent classroom and correctly interpreting the sounds as indicating some kind of crisis that required immediate intervention. He took in the scene quickly. Rowan standing calmly in the center of the room, Braden rubbing his arm, Jackson still catching his breath, and 30 students staring in stunned silence. His athletic background and coaching experience allowed him to rapidly assess what had happened. The way Rowan carried herself, the positioning of the students, and the atmosphere in the room told a clear story of someone who had successfully defended herself against multiple attackers with skill and restraint. "Is everything okay in here?" he asked, his eyes immediately finding Rowan's torn blouse and noting her composed demeanor despite what had obviously been a physical confrontation. "Everything's fine now," she replied, smoothing down her hair and adjusting her torn clothing with the kind of dignity that impressed everyone watching. "We were just having a discussion about personal boundaries and respect." David's expression shifted from concern to something approaching admiration as he realized what had occurred and recognized the skill with which she had handled what could have been a dangerous situation. His own martial arts background allowed him to appreciate the level of control and precision that her response had required. "Well," he said, his voice carefully neutral but tinged with what sounded like approval, "it sounds like an important lesson. I'll let you get back to it." As he left, Rowan heard him chuckling softly in the hallway, a sound that made her heart flutter despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system, and confirmed that she had gained something valuable from someone whose opinion mattered to her. "Now then," she said, turning back to her class with the kind of smooth transition that demonstrated her ability to return to normal operations despite extraordinary circumstances. "Who can tell me about a character in literature who had to find the courage to stand up for themselves?" Alexis's hand shot up immediately, her face glowing with new respect and enthusiasm. "Atticus Finch," she said, her voice strong and confident. "He stood up for what was right, even when everyone was against him, even when it was dangerous." "Excellent example," Rowan replied, settling back into her teaching rhythm as if the previous confrontation had been nothing more than a minor interruption. What made his courage particularly noteworthy? The class discussion that followed was the most engaged and productive she had experienced since arriving at Lincoln High School. Students who had never participated before raised their hands with thoughtful questions and observations. Even some of Braden's former allies contributed meaningful comments about moral integrity, personal responsibility, and the importance of standing up to bullying behavior. Braden himself remained silent for the rest of the period, but he didn't cause any disruptions. He sat in his seat, occasionally touching his wrist and shooting glances at Rowan with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than hostility. The transformation wasn't dramatic or complete, but the fundamental dynamic had shifted in ways that everyone in the room could recognize. When the bell rang to end third period, students filed out in unusual quiet, many of them looking back at their teacher with new eyes. The phone recordings were already being shared throughout Lincoln High School, but the narrative was not what Braden had intended when his campaign had begun. Instead of a humiliated teacher, the videos showed a competent professional defending herself with skill and restraint. Instead of weakness, they documented strength. Instead of chaos, they captured control. Alexis lingered after the others had left, approaching Rowan's desk with obvious concern, mixed with admiration. "Miss Blackwell, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine care. That was incredible. I had no idea you knew martial arts." "I'm fine, thank you," Rowan replied, examining the tear in her blouse and noting that it could probably be repaired with some careful stitching. "And yes, I've been training for several years. It's a hobby I don't usually discuss at work. Will you get in trouble for what happened?" Rowan considered the question carefully, drawing on her understanding of legal principles and administrative procedures. "I defended myself against a physical assault using reasonable force that was appropriate to the threat I faced. The recordings will show that clearly. If anything, this might finally get the administration's attention about what's been happening in this classroom." Her analysis proved prescient. Word spread through Lincoln High School faster than weekend party gossip, and by the end of the day, the incident had become the primary topic of conversation among students, faculty, and administrators. Rather than facing disciplinary action, Rowan found herself receiving support from colleagues who had previously seemed unaware of her struggles. Several teachers approached her throughout the day to express admiration for her handling of a difficult situation, and Mrs. Patterson even made a point of acknowledging that sometimes students need to understand that actions have consequences. The transformation extended far beyond her classroom as news of the incident spread throughout the school community, fundamentally altering the dynamics that had made her first semester so challenging and establishing her as someone who commanded respect through both competence and strength. Chapter 9. The Aftermath and Transformation. The weekend following the confrontation passed in a blur of reflection, phone calls, and unexpected visitors, as word of what had happened in room 204B spread throughout the Lincoln High School community and beyond. Rowan found herself at the center of a narrative that was being interpreted very differently by various constituencies, but the overwhelming response was one of support and admiration for her measured response to an unprecedented situation. Saturday morning brought a knock on her apartment door that she hadn't expected. Principal Robert Morrison stood in the hallway, looking somewhat uncomfortable, but determined to have a conversation that clearly couldn't wait until Monday morning. "Miss Blackwell," he said, his tone formal but not hostile, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to discuss Friday's incident in person rather than waiting for the official administrative review." Rowan invited him in, noting that his demeanor suggested someone who was dealing with a complex situation that didn't fit neatly into standard disciplinary categories. As Braden's uncle, he was presumably conflicted about how to handle an incident involving his nephew, but as a principal, he had responsibilities that transcended family relationships. "I've reviewed the recordings extensively," he began once they were seated in her modest living room. "Multiple angles, complete timeline, everything that's available. Your response was completely appropriate and professionally handled." The statement came as a relief, but Rowan could see that there was more he wanted to say. "I also want to apologize," he continued, his voice reflecting genuine regret. "It's clear from the evidence that what you were experiencing went far beyond normal classroom disruption, and our administrative response was inadequate. You should have received better support from the beginning." His acknowledgement of institutional failure was both validating and surprising. School administrators rarely admitted mistakes so directly, and his willingness to do so suggested that the incident had forced a re-evaluation of policies and procedures that had allowed the harassment to continue unchecked. "My nephew needed that reality check," he added, his voice becoming more personal. "Braden has been protected from consequences for too long, and it took someone with your skills and restraint to teach him that actions have meaningful results. His grades have already started improving, and his attitude has changed dramatically." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering not just the immediate incident, but the broader context of bullying, family dynamics, and the challenges of maintaining discipline in contemporary public schools. Principal Morrison proved to be more thoughtful and self-aware than Rowan had expected, and his insights into the systemic issues that had enabled the harassment were both enlightening and encouraging. "What you did Friday wasn't just self-defense," he concluded as he prepared to leave. "You taught an entire classroom about boundaries, consequences, and the difference between patience and weakness. That's exactly the kind of lesson that some of our students desperately need." Monday morning brought a transformation in the atmosphere at Lincoln High School that was immediately apparent to anyone who had been paying attention to the underlying tensions that had characterized the first semester. Rowan arrived to find her parking space clear, her classroom undisturbed, and a stack of messages from colleagues expressing support and admiration for her handling of the Friday incident. The first 2 periods of the day proceeded normally, but there was an anticipatory energy in the building as news of what had happened spread, and students wondered how the dynamic in third period American literature would change. When 10:47 a.m. arrived, the transformation was immediately apparent. Braden Morrison walked into room 204B at exactly 10:45 a.m., 2 minutes early, for the first time since the semester had begun. His entrance was quiet and respectful, without the theatrical slamming of doors or announcements of his presence that had characterized his previous arrivals. Colton Hayes and Jackson Turner followed within the next minute, taking their seats without fanfare or the predatory expressions that had made them so intimidating during the previous months. The change wasn't dramatic or complete, but the fundamental dynamic had shifted in ways that everyone in the room could recognize. "Good morning, everyone," Rowan said, her voice carrying the professional warmth that had been strained but never broken during the difficult weeks. "I hope you all had a good weekend. Today we're going to continue our discussion of moral courage, and I'd like to start by examining how characters respond when they're tested by difficult circumstances. For the first time in months, students opened their textbooks without being reminded, took out notebooks without being prompted, and generally demonstrated the kind of basic respect for the learning environment that effective education required. When Rowan asked for volunteers to read aloud, multiple hands went up, including students who had been silent for weeks due to fear of being mocked or targeted. When she posed questions for discussion, the responses were thoughtful and engaged rather than sarcastic or disruptive. Perhaps most significantly, when other students shared their thoughts during class discussion, there were no stage whispers, eye rolls, or other undermining behaviors that had made meaningful dialogue impossible during the previous semester. Braden himself participated in the discussion with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than calculated disruption. When called upon, his responses demonstrated that he had actually done the reading and understood the material, suggesting that his previous behavior had been strategic rather than academic. "What do you think motivates Atticus to continue defending Tom Robinson even when he knows the case is likely hopeless?" Rowan asked during a particularly engaged moment in the discussion. Braden raised his hand, and when called upon, he provided an answer that surprised everyone in the room. Maybe he knows that doing the right thing isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about showing other people what integrity looks like, even when it costs you something. The response was thoughtful, well articulated, and completely different from the kind of disruption he had been providing for months. Other students looked at him with surprise, and Rowan nodded with genuine approval. "That's an excellent observation, Braden. Can you connect that idea to other characters we've studied this semester?" The discussion that followed was exactly the kind of intellectual engagement that literature teachers hope to facilitate. Students built on each other's ideas, made connections between different texts, and demonstrated the kind of critical thinking skills that would serve them well in college and beyond. When the period ended, students gathered their materials and filed out with the quiet satisfaction of people who had accomplished something worthwhile rather than merely survived another day of educational warfare. Braden lingered after the others had left, approaching Rowan's desk with an expression that combined embarrassment with something that might have been respect. "Miss Blackwell," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for what happened Friday. I was way out of line, and I'm sorry for all the trouble I caused this semester." She studied his face for signs of insincerity, but found none. The apology seemed genuine, and his body language suggested someone who was actually experiencing remorse rather than simply going through the motions required by administrative intervention. "Thank you, Braden. I appreciate that," she replied, her tone warm but cautious. "What made you realize that changes were needed?" He thought for a moment before answering, and his response revealed insights that had been developing beneath the surface of his disruptive behavior. "I guess I thought teachers were just pushover adults who couldn't do anything about troublemakers like me. I figured I could get away with whatever I wanted because you wouldn't fight back." His assessment of the power dynamic had been accurate during the early weeks of school, when Rowan had been constrained by professional protocols and administrative expectations that had prevented effective responses to systematic harassment. "Most teachers could do quite a lot," Rowan replied gently, "but we choose not to because we believe in education, positive reinforcement, and the potential for students to make better choices when given the opportunity. What happened Friday was self-defense, not education." Understanding passed across his features as he began to comprehend the restraint that had been exercised on his behalf during months when he had been pushing boundaries without consequences. "How long have you been doing martial arts?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing the calculation that had characterized his previous interactions with her. 8 years. I started in college for confidence and self-defense, but it became much more than that. It taught me discipline, respect, and the importance of using strength responsibly. Why didn't you mention it before? I mean, if we had known you could fight, we probably wouldn't have messed with you. His question revealed the adolescent logic that had guided his behavior. The assumption that authority figures were weak unless they demonstrated physical capability, and that respect was something that had to be earned through intimidation rather than competence. Because I wanted to be known as a good teacher, not as someone who could fight, Rowan explained patiently. What happened Friday was about protecting myself, not about proving my abilities or intimidating students. For what it's worth, Braden said as he prepared to leave, you are a good teacher. I was just too stupid and too arrogant to realize it before. The conversation marked a turning point that extended far beyond individual behavioral changes. Over the following days and weeks, the transformation in room 204B became a model for how classroom dynamics could shift when respect was established through demonstrated competence rather than imposed authority. Colton Hayes and Jackson Turner, taking cues from their former leader, also adjusted their behavior in ways that suggested genuine learning rather than simple compliance. The disruption ceased entirely, and actual education became possible for the first time since the semester had begun. Other students who had been silent observers during the months of harassment began participating more actively in class discussions, apparently feeling safer now that the climate of intimidation had been replaced by an atmosphere of mutual respect. Alexis Chen, who had been reluctant to show enthusiasm for fear of being targeted, returned to her previous level of engagement and began staying after class to discuss literature with the kind of intellectual excitement that made teaching rewarding. Chapter 10: New Relationships and Understanding. The transformation in Rowan's professional life was accompanied by significant developments in her personal relationships, particularly with David Kim, whose support during the difficult months had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than either of them had initially anticipated. Their coffee conversations, which had provided crucial emotional support during the harassment campaign, became more frequent and personal as they processed what had happened and explored what it meant for their growing friendship. I have to admit, David said during one of their after-school talks, I was incredibly impressed by your technique on Friday. That wrist control was textbook perfect, and the way you handled multiple opponents showed real experience. Rowan blushed at the compliment, still adjusting to the idea that her martial arts background was no longer a secret she needed to keep separate from her professional identity. You know martial arts? She asked, surprised by his technical knowledge of what she had done. I wrestled in college and still train occasionally at a local gym, he replied, his eyes reflecting genuine admiration. I recognized the professionalism in how you handled that situation. You could have really hurt him if you had wanted to. His understanding of the restraint she had exercised was both validating and attractive. Unlike colleagues who saw only the dramatic confrontation, David appreciated the skill and control that had prevented serious injury while effectively ending the harassment. That was never the goal, she said firmly. I just needed him to understand that boundaries exist and have consequences when they're crossed. Their shared appreciation for martial arts provided a new dimension to their relationship, and David's respect for her abilities was refreshing after months of feeling like she had to hide important aspects of who she was. Would you like to train together sometime? He asked during one of their conversations. I know a good gym that has excellent facilities for both wrestling and striking arts. The invitation represented a significant step in their relationship, moving from professional support to personal sharing of interests and activities. Rowan accepted eagerly, looking forward to training with someone who understood both the physical and philosophical aspects of martial arts. Their first training session together revealed complementary skills and compatible approaches to martial arts that strengthened their bond both personally and athletically. David's wrestling background provided excellent takedown defense and ground control, while Rowan's striking skills and submission techniques offered different tactical options for sparring scenarios. "You're really good at this," he said, after a particularly technical rolling session where she had demonstrated several submissions he hadn't encountered before. "So are you," she replied, genuinely impressed by his technique and conditioning. "Your base is incredibly solid. I can see why you were successful in college wrestling." Training together provided them with shared experiences that were both challenging and enjoyable, and their mutual respect for each other's abilities created a foundation for deeper personal connection. As autumn progressed toward winter, their relationship evolved from collegial support to genuine romance, marked by hiking expeditions in the Colorado mountains, dinners at restaurants that served cuisines from around the world, and long conversations about literature, education, and their hopes for the future. "I was attracted to you from the beginning," David admitted during one of their Saturday morning hikes in the foothills west of Denver. "But watching how you handled that situation with such grace and strength made me realize that you're exactly the kind of person I want in my life." His honesty was both touching and encouraging, and Rowan found herself opening up about her own feelings in ways that felt natural and comfortable. "I was so worried about what you would think," she confessed, as they paused to enjoy the view from a rocky outcropping. "I thought you might see me differently if you knew about the martial arts training." "Are you kidding?" he replied with genuine surprise. "That just made you more attractive. Intelligence, strength, and the wisdom to use both responsibly, that's pretty much the perfect combination." Their relationship provided both of them with emotional support and personal fulfillment that enhanced their professional effectiveness and overall happiness. For Rowan, having someone who understood and appreciated all aspects of her personality was liberating after months of feeling like she had to hide important parts of who she was. Chapter 11. Lasting Changes and New Beginnings. The winter months following the confrontation brought continued improvements in classroom dynamics that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the November incident. Word of what had happened spread throughout Lincoln High School's student body, but rather than creating fear or resentment, it seemed to establish a new baseline of respect for teachers and authority figures. Students who had previously tested boundaries in other classrooms began demonstrating more respectful behavior, apparently having learned that educators might possess capabilities and resources that they hadn't previously considered. The change wasn't dramatic or universal, but veteran teachers noticed a subtle shift in attitude that made their jobs more manageable and effective. Mrs. Patterson, the vice principal who had initially suggested that Rowan simply needed to build better rapport with her students, approached her with a very different perspective during a conversation in early December. "I wanted to thank you," she said during a brief encounter in the administrative office. "What you did has had ripple effects throughout the building. We're seeing better behavior in classrooms across all grade levels." The acknowledgement was gratifying, but it also highlighted how the administration's initial response had failed to address the systematic nature of what Rowan had been experiencing. The incident had forced school leaders to re-evaluate their approaches to student discipline and teacher support in ways that would benefit future educators who found themselves in similar situations. Braden Morrison's transformation proved to be genuine and lasting rather than temporary compliance, motivated by fear. His academic performance improved dramatically as he began applying the intelligence and leadership skills that had previously been directed toward disruption to actual learning and positive peer influence. During a parent-teacher conference in January, his mother expressed amazement at the changes she was observing at home. He actually talks about literature now, she told Rowan with obvious pride and surprise. He comes home from school excited about books and ideas. I haven't seen him this engaged with academics since elementary school. The conversation was particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had initially been defensive about her son's behavior and resistant to suggestions that changes were needed. Her recognition of Rowan's positive influence represented a validation that extended beyond simple classroom management to genuine educational impact. Braden himself became one of Rowan's most improved students, and his essay on moral courage was among the best she received during the spring semester. When she returned the graded paper with an A-, he lingered after class to discuss it. "I wrote about you," he admitted, his tone reflecting genuine thoughtfulness rather than the manipulation that had characterized his previous communications. "About me?" Rowan asked, surprised by the revelation. "About how it takes real courage to be patient with people who don't deserve it, but also to stand up for yourself when patience isn't enough anymore. You could have gotten me expelled or arrested, but you chose to teach me instead." His insight into the restraint she had exercised was remarkably mature, and suggested that the incident had prompted genuine reflection about respect, consequences, and the appropriate use of power. "What will you remember most about this year?" she asked, curious about his perspective on the transformation that had occurred. He thought for a moment before responding with an answer that surprised her with its depth and sincerity. "That you could have destroyed me that day, but you chose to help me instead. That's the kind of person I want to be, someone who has the power to hurt people, but chooses to help them instead." The conversation represented everything that education could achieve at its best. The transformation of destructive impulses into positive growth, the development of empathy and wisdom, and the recognition that strength was most meaningful when it was exercised with restraint and purpose. Chapter 12. Spring Renewal and Future Possibilities. As spring semester progressed, Rowan found herself settled into the kind of teaching rhythm that she had hoped to achieve when she first arrived at Lincoln High School. Her classes were characterized by enthusiastic participation, thoughtful discussion, and the kind of intellectual energy that made education rewarding for both students and teachers. The reputation she had earned through the November incident opened doors that had previously been closed to her. Veteran teachers who had seemed aloof during her early months began seeking her advice on classroom management strategies. Department colleagues invited her to collaborate on curriculum development projects. Even administrators consulted her perspective on policy issues related to student discipline and teacher support. "You